The streets of Rome bullied with restless voices of men who argued with passion about the fate of the Republic. There was something in the air, a dense, almost electric sensation. The walls of the houses, the crowded markets, even the temples seemed to contain secrets about to explode. Rome, that majestic city that had raised like the lighthouse of the Mediterranean world, was trapped at a dangerous crossroads. The Senate, composed of the richest and most powerful men in the Republic, dominated decisions from its cold marbles. They talked about tradition, of preserving order, but in reality they clung with nails and teeth to their privileges. Faced with them, another group, the popular ones, with a different vision. They were the voice of the dispossessed, of the peasants who plowed the exhausted land, of the war veterans who returned home just to find it in ruins. At night, when the torches barely illuminated the streets, rumors of discontent were heard. Peasants expelled from their lands to give way to the vast farms of the senators. Veteran soldiers who, after years of service, were ignored as if their scars mean nothing. Inequality grew as a long and threatening shadow. But it wasn't just poverty or wealth that divided Rome. There was something deeper, something that fell his soul. The reforms proposed by men like the Graco brothers, decades before, had lit a fire that still burned. Those who talked about distributing land to the poor or giving more power to the people ended up dead, killed in public streets or in strange conspiracies. The senators feared losing control and did not hesitate to use violence to protect it. Meanwhile, the popular gained strength. They were not saints, of course. There was also ambition in their ranks, men who were looking for their own glory. But there was something that differentiated them: they promised hope to the desperate. In the squares, the speeches resonated strongly, and people piled up to listen. The people deserve justice, they shouted, and the crowds responded with cheers that made the columns of the buildings tremble. However, these tensions were not simple political debates. The factions often faced violently. There were nights in which Rome seemed more a battlefield than a civilized city. Armed bands hired by senators toured the streets, attacking popular leaders. In response, the popular formed their own guards. Blood stained the forums where only laws were discussed. Life in Rome felt unstable, as if it were on the verge of a precipice. The rich families protected behind high walls, fearing the revolts. The poor, meanwhile, dreamed of leaders who could change their destiny. And among all this chaos, the generals became increasingly powerful. Men like Mario and Sylla, who could command loyal armies, began to be seen as the true owners of the fate of Rome. Sylla, with his march on Rome, had shown that the legions could control the policy. His actions had left a deep scar. The Republic, that institution that was supposed eternal, had been humiliated by a man who did not hesitate to spill Roman blood on behalf of his ambition. Years later, the memory of that march was still weighing. People wondered, what if another general decided to do the same? The Forum, which was once the heart of the city, had become a place of intrigues and betrayals. The senators walked through their corridors as if they were ghosts, always looking over the shoulder. Each pronounced word was a possible threat, each alliance was temporary. And then, just when it seemed that Rome could not be divided, a man appeared who would change everyone's fate. An ambitious, intelligent young man, who had learned since childhood to play with the rules of power. He was not an old senator or a desperate peasant, but something completely different. A man who saw beyond the disputes of his time, who dreamed of something bigger. But there was still for his name to resonate in everyone's ears. The wind blew on the Tiber, carrying with him the murmur of a city on the edge of a change that no one could foresee. And while the senators followed their games and the crowds cried out for justice, in some corner of Rome, fate began to draw their next movement. The story was just beginning, and the noise of the tragedy steps could already feel in the distance. Rome was a battlefield disguised as a city. The social tensions were not new, but under the grace, these tensions had reached a rupture point that left indelible scars in the Republic. The Tiberio and Chio Graco brothers was not simple politicians, they were men who dared to challenge the immutable structures of a Rome governed by the ambition of a few. And although their names ended up written with blood, the ideas they defended did not die with them. Tiberius's face was known in the squares. He spoke with a passion that seemed to light the air around him. He proposed something unthinkable for the senators: to redistribute public lands among the poor. It wasn't just an idea, it was a direct affront to the privileges of the landowner aristocracy. The peasants who had been stripped by generations saw a savior in him, while the rich looked at him like a dangerous enemy. When Tiberius was killed at the hands of a senatorial mob, it was not only his body that was destroyed in the streets, so was the illusion that Rome could change without violence. But his brother, did not let himself be intimidated. With more determination, he brought his proposals even further, seeking not only agrarian justice, but also reforms that gave real power to the people. Chio talked about justice, but in the eyes of his enemies, there was only threat. His death was no less brutal than Tiberius, and Rome was dying of blood again. These episodes were not forgotten. They were the prologue of a time when power would no longer be resolved in speeches, but on the edge of the swords. Years later, the spirit of the Gracchos was still alive, although turned into a wound that never closed. In this environment of constant struggle, a man whose shadow would grow until reaching the limits of the Republic, Gao Mario. He was not a refined aristocrat, but a man born in the rural regions of Arpino, far from the luxury of Rome. But Mario was ambitious, and his talent for war opened doors that others could only dream. Mario did not settle for being a simple general. The army amended, making it a professional war machine. The legions no longer depended on rich citizens who could afford their team. Now, any man could get ready. This not only transformed the army, but also changed the dynamics of power in Rome. The soldiers, now more loyal to their generals than to the Senate, became a double-edged sword for the Republic. In his military campaigns, Mario demonstrated a tactical genius that earned him an eternal place in Roman history. He defeated the Cimbrios and Teutons, barbarian tribes who had threatened to crush Rome. The victories of Mario raised him to the hero's range, but also filled him with enemies in the Senate, who saw in him a threat to his authority. Mario was not only a military leader, he was also a man who deeply influenced the life of a young man named Julius Caesar. Mario was married to Julia, Caesar's aunt, and although Caesar was just a child at that time, he grew up under the influence of his political uncle's ideas. Mario showed that power was not a privilege reserved for the aristocracy, but something that could be conquered with audacity and strategy. However, Mario's life was not exempt from tragedies. At the end of his career, his clashes with Sylla, another ambitious general, unleashed a civil war that fractured even more to Rome. Mario died old, exiled from a city he had once saved. But his legacy, his reforms, and his vision of a professional army remained as an echo that would resonate in the coming years. While the flames of social struggles continued to consume the Republic, the young Caesar watched, learned. In his eyes, the chaos of the time was not a warning, but an opportunity. He learned from Mario the importance of the legions, but also understood the lessons of the Gracchos: if you wanted to change Rome, you should be willing to pay a very high price. And so, in a Rome that seemed more broken than ever, fate began to draw the lines of a man who would use the same weapons of his predecessors to mold a future that no one could foresee. A future in which Mario's lessons and Gracchos' dreams would find a new form, in a leader who would change the course of history forever. In a cold morning of July 12, 100 BC, Rome saw a child who, although no one knew it then, would change forever the course of history. Gaius Julius Caesar arrived in the world in a patricia family, the Jowls, who claimed to descend directly from Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. Although of noble lineage, the Jowls did not enjoy great wealth or the influence they once had. This contrast between his glorious heritage and his modest reality marked Caesar's first years, forging in him an ambition that would promote him to overcome any obstacle. As a child, Caesar demonstrated a curiosity and intelligence that differentiated him from others. Rome was his playground, but also his school. He walked between the forums, observing the political intrigues, the speeches lit, and the subtle maneuvers that were carried out in the shadows. It was a vibrant and ruthless city, where power was disputed as a trophy and life could change in an instant. His father, also called Gaius Julius Caesar, instructed him in family traditions and in the pride of his lineage. However, it was his mother, Aurelia, who left an indelible brand in his character. Strong and intelligent woman, Aurelia personally supervised her education and instilled in her discipline, eloquence, and a deep understanding of the social nuances of Rome. It was said that Caesar inherited from her not only her mental sharpness, but also her unwavering determination. Aurelia hired the best tutors for his son. Caesar studied grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy under the guidance of Greek teachers, as Hellenic influence dominated the thought of the Roman elite. He learned about Homer, Socrates, and Aristotle, but also on the military strategists who had left their mark in the ancient world. This knowledge was intertwined in their mind, forming a unique vision that combined Greek logic with Roman cunning. In his adolescence years, Caesar showed a special inclination for oratory. The words, for him, were powerful weapons, capable of beating wills and gain hearts. Soon he began to practice speeches in front of his family, perfecting his tone, his gestures, and his gaze. At that time, it seemed that he not only spoke to an imaginary audience, but to Rome itself, as if he knew that one day the world would listen to him. But life was not kind to young Caesar. At 16, he lost his father suddenly. The death of Gaius Julius Caesar left the family in a vulnerable position, and the young man had to assume the role of head of the home at an early age. The responsibility weighed on his shoulders, but instead of crushing him, he strengthened him. He learned to make difficult decisions, negotiate hard, and protect his. Meanwhile, Rome was still a political minefield. Power was in the hands of the Senate, but internal divisions and personal ambitions weakened it. It was a time of ephemeral alliances, betrayals, and violence. Caesar, from a distance, watched as men like Mario and Sylla, key figures of his time, mold the republic with their own hands. His entry into politics was not a great act, but a calculated movement. At 18, he married Cornelia, daughter of an influential popular politician. This marriage not only strengthened its ties with the reformist sectors, but also made it clear that Caesar had a vision beyond the traditional interests of the aristocracy. Sylla, the Rome dictator at the time, did not see young people like Caesar with good eyes, who seemed to bow towards the ideals of the popular. When Sylla ordered that Caesar divorced Cornelia, he refused, openly challenging the most powerful man in the republic. This decision forced him to flee and live hidden, but also marked a before and after in his life. In those days of uncertainty, while hiding in distant lands, Caesar did not stop learning. He served in the army, demonstrating his courage on the battlefield and winning the respect of his superiors. He was captured by pirates in the Aegean Sea, but even in that dangerous situation, he showed an audacity that baffled his captors. He promised that he would crucify them, and fulfilled his word when he was released. When he finally returned to Rome, he was no longer an inexperienced young man, but a man shaped by adversities. His eyes reflected the hardness of the path traveled, but also the spark of someone who had much more to achieve. With every step he took in the streets of Rome, it seemed that fate itself pushed him toward something bigger, something that still remained hidden on the horizon, waiting to be claimed by him. The rise of Lucio Cornelio Sylla as a dictator marked one of the darkest times of the Roman Republic, a time where absolute power was imposed on the law, and the life of a man could be turned off with a single order. In the midst of this political storm, Julius Caesar, still young and ambitious, found himself in the center of the danger. There was something in Caesar that worried Sylla. Perhaps it was his connection with the popular, the political faction that represented a challenge to the Senate oligarchy, or perhaps it was his challenging character, that spark of independence that made him uncontrollable. When Caesar married Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, an ally of the popular and enemy of Sylla, the dictator soon reacted. Sylla, who had seen many fall under his iron fist, demanded Caesar to repudiate Cornelia. It was a calculated movement. By forcing him to break this link, Sylla intended to tear his loyalty to the ideals of effort. But what happened later was an early sample of the unwavering will of Caesar. Caesar refused. It was a reckless decision, almost suicidal. Facing Sylla not only meant risking his career, but his own life. The dictator, furious, ordered that Caesar was included in the proscribed list, a conviction that made him a man outside the law, with a death sentence that could be executed by anyone. With the weight of persecution on his shoulders, Caesar fled from Rome. His escape was not that of a coward, but that of someone who understood that to survive and fight another day, he had to escape the reach of his enemy. He walked for days, crossing hostile land, always with the fear of being captured. The stories say that he even seriously ill during his exile, but his determination kept him standing. At a time when others would have raised, Caesar showed a resistance that few could match. But beyond his own strength, he had something unexpected, the intercession of his friends and family, who convinced Sylla to forgive his life. It is said that, accessing forgiveness, Sylla pronounced a phrase that would resonate in history: "In this boy there are many Morios." For Sylla, Caesar represented not only a present threat, but a future danger, a man who, like his uncle Mario, could challenge the established order. When the immediate danger passed, Caesar did not return to Rome immediately. He decided to join the army, a shelter where he could rebuild his reputation away from political intrigues. There, he showed a courage and a skill that highlighted him among his teammates. He won a civic crown, one of the greatest military distinctions, for saving the life of a fellow soldier in battle. But Caesar was not destined to remain in the shadows. Upon returning to Rome, after Sylla's death and the dissolution of his dictatorship, he was not the same man who had fled years before. He had learned to move between unpredictable currents of politics and war. He had known the taste of defeat, but also the force obtained by surviving it. As a minor pontiff, a religious position that acquired at this stage, Caesar began to rebuild his political life. He participated in ceremonies, strengthened alliances, and cultivated the image of a devout and honorable man, all while carefully weaving the first threads of what his vast power would be. Every step he took was loaded with intention, as if fate was silently guided towards a place reserved only for him. But the scars of the confrontation with Sylla remained, not as marks of weakness, but as reminders that the path to greatness is always paved with obstacles. And although Sylla's chapter had come to an end, another began to be written in the streets of Rome. One where Caesar, more cunning and more determined than ever, would show that he was not only a survivor, but an architect of the future who would soon transform the Republic into something that no one could imagine. The first stage of Julio Caesar's military career led him far from Rome, to foreign lands where his skills would be tested and his character shaped by the steel of war and the survival tension. He was young, ambitious, and his name still did not resonate with the force that one day he would do it immortal. But even then, his actions began to stand out, leaving indelible brands in those around him. In Asia Minor, Caesar served as an officer under the command of Marco Minucio Termo, a governor who faced revolts and tensions in a region always on the edge of chaos. It was during the campaign in Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos, where Caesar showed extraordinary value. The city had rebelled against Rome, and its siege was fierce. In the midst of the fight, Caesar led a group of men in a reckless action to save his comrades trapped by the enemy. That feat earned him the civic crown, an award reserved only for those who, in battle, saved the life of another Roman citizen. It was more than a medal, it was a symbol of heroism and loyalty that raised his reputation among his companions of arms and superiors. However, fate had prepared an unexpected turn for Caesar. On his way back, while navigating the Aegean Sea, his ship was intercepted by Cilicious pirates, known for his brutality and boldness. Caesar was captured and taken to a remote island, where the pirates demanded a rescue of 20 silver talents. Most prisoners in their situation would have fallen into despair, but not Caesar. From the beginning, his attitude dislodged the pirates. With an almost arrogant air of superiority, he made fun of them for asking for such little money, assuring them that at least 50 talents were worth. That mixture of humor and challenge baffled the bandits, who ended up accepting Arlo as a peculiar and almost nice figure. While his friends raised the rescue, Caesar moved among the pirates with a boldness that seemed to touch the recklessness. He ordered them to shut up when he wanted to sleep and participated in his activities as if he were a guest, not a captive. But behind his apparent calm, he housed a silent oath: not only would he recover his freedom, but would make his captors pay for his boldness. When the rescue arrived and Caesar was released, he did not waste time to fulfill his promise. He gathered a small fleet, returned to the island where he had been a prisoner, and attacked the pirates with a speed and ferocity that took them completely unsuspecting. He captured them all, recovered the rescue money, and took them to Pergamo, where he delivered them to the governor. But Roman justice was slow and, for Caesar, insufficient. When he learned that the pirates could be released, he took the matter in his own hands. He ordered his crucifixion, a severe and definitive punishment. However, in a gesture that revealed both his humanity and his sense of honor, he allowed men to die quickly, cutting their throats before they suffered on the cross. This episode not only highlighted its courage, but also its ability to impose respect and justice in a chaotic world. The pirates, who had underestimated him as a young nobleman without experience, had learned too late that Julius Caesar was a man who fulfilled his promises, even the most terrible. Upon returning to Rome, Caesar carried more than war stories and bailouts. He had tried the taste of danger and had shown that his determination did not know limits. In each action, each decision made during those early years, the shadow of the leader that would transform the course of history was glimpsed. But Caesar didn't stop looking back. His days in Asia Minor and his confrontation with the pirates were only the prelude to a life that was deployed as an unstoppable river, willing to destroy everything that was in their way. And while Rome waited for his return, he continued to build, step by step, the legacy that one day would become a legend. Julius Caesar's return to Rome marked the beginning of his political career, a land as dangerous as any battlefield. But Caesar was not a common man. He knew that in Rome politics it was not enough with ambition and talent, a deep understanding of human passions was needed and how to direct them in their favor. As a military tribune, he took his first steps in the political world. His role, although modest, allowed him to be close to the strategic decisions of the army and build key relationships with officers and soldiers. But Caesar didn't seek to stay in anyone's shadow. His vision was on top, and knew that each movement should be calculated. The next step was the position of quaestor, an administrative position in charge of managing the finances of Rome and its provinces. It was assigned to Spanish Hispania, a distant but rich region, where Caesar began to understand the complexities of economic power. During his time there, he not only fulfilled his duties, but closely observed how the riches of the empire were used to consolidate control in Rome. This knowledge would be vital for your future plans. Back in the city, Caesar ascended to mayor. This position gave him a perfect platform to conquer the heart of the people. The mayor had the responsibility of organizing public games and festivals, events that were the soul of Roman life. And Caesar, with its characteristic greatness, brought these celebrations to a level never seen before. The games they organized were not mere shows, they were manifestations of their political genius. Gladiator fighting, car races, improvised theaters, all was done with a waste of resources that left citizens breathless. The rumor said that Caesar borrowed greatly to finance these festivities, but he didn't care. I understood something that others did not: the masses could be conquered with splendor and generosity. Each event was a propaganda masterpiece. While citizens cheered, Caesar walked between them, smiling, greeting, listening. He was a town man, although his ambition led him to dream beyond the streets of Rome. The murmurs began to circulate: Caesar is not like the other nobles. He understands what we need. However, not everything was celebration. Political intrigues were always present. The Optimates, the aristocratic faction that defended the privileges of the Senate, observed with distrust of Caesar's meteoric ascent. They saw him as a dangerous man, a populist who put the established order at risk. But Caesar knew how to walk on the tightrope. Despite their proximity to the popular, he took care not to face AB Ringly to the Senate. He used the art of persuasion and charm to win allies, and, when necessary, he made strategic concessions to calm his opponents. Every step he took, every decision he made, was guided by a clarity of purpose that left his rivals bewildered. While others sought immediate power, Caesar built a longer path, one that would eventually lead him to places where no other man had arrived. And while Rome vibrated with the echoes of its games and celebrations, Caesar moved on, always looking towards the horizon. I knew that politics was not a sprint, but a marathon, and was willing to run until the end. The crowds worshipped him, the nobles feared him, and the Republic, although he still did not know, was on the verge of a change that would define everything. The marriage, in the Rome of Julius Caesar, was not a matter of the heart, but a calculated game of power, influence and alliances. Caesar understood this game from a young age, and although in his life there were women who marked their history, each union represented a strategic movement on the political board of their time. Cornelia was his first marriage and, without a doubt, the most significant in his training years. She was the daughter of Lucio Cornelio Cinna, one of Mario's main allies, the leader of the popular and enemy of Sylla's jury. This link not only consolidated it as part of a powerful political faction, but also demonstrated its loyalty to a dangerous cause. When Sylla took power as a dictator, he demanded that Caesar repudiate Cornelia, a lawsuit that many would have accepted without hesitation. But Caesar, with a determination that would later define his life, refused. That act of challenge almost cost him life. He was stripped of his inheritance, persecuted and forced to flee, but his decision made clear one thing: Caesar was not a man who betrayed his principles or the people who considered part of his life. The premature death of Cornelia was a blow to Caesar, although the loss did not deviate him from his way. While her union with her was full of political ideals and loyalties, she was also the only marriage where there was something deeper: mutual respect and admiration. Over time, and on his return to the political heart of Rome, Caesar married Pompeia, granddaughter of Sylla. This union had a clear purpose: to appease tensions with the conservative elite and show that he was willing to build bridges even with those who had been his enemies. But this marriage was destined to be brief. The scandal known as the Bona Dei incident sealed Pompeia's fate as Caesar's wife. A man named Publio Clodio Pulchro disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred ritual reserved only for women, carried out in Caesar's house. Although the direct involvement of Pompeia could not be proven, the mere suspicion was enough for Caesar to choose to divorce it. He did it with a phrase that would go down in history: Caesar's wife should not only be honored, it must also seem it. This decision not only reinforced his public image as a man of principles, but also released him to seek more useful alliances. His third and last marriage was with Calpurnia, daughter of Lucio Calpurnio Pisan Cessanino, an influential politician. This union came at a crucial moment of his career, when Caesar was already consul and was consolidating his position as a key figure in Rome. Calpurnia, in contrast to his previous wives, was a model of discretion and loyalty. Although its relationship was more pragmatic than passionate, Calpurnia became silent and unwavering support in the most turbulent moments of Caesar's life. But Caesar's marriages were not only their wives. His ability to build and maintain family alliances extended to all aspects of his personal life. Through his daughter Julia, he forged one of the most powerful ties of his career: his alliance with Pompey, the great general of Rome. Julia, on the other hand, was known for her intelligence and her ability to unite the two most powerful men of the time. However, his premature death broke that connection, leaving a crack that would later become an insurmountable abyss between Caesar and Pompey. Each marriage, every relationship that Caesar cultivated, was a reflection of his ability to navigate in the turbulent waters of Roman politics. The unions that forged not only strengthened him, but also gave him the tools to build the empire he dreamed. However, in the tangle of alliances and strategies, a truth remained constant: for Caesar, love and ambition were always intertwined, but politics was the dominant force that guided its destiny. The Maximum Pontiff title was not simply a religious position in the Rome of Julio Caesar, it was one of the most influential positions, a political tool coated with holiness. When obtaining this title, Caesar was not only consolidated as the maximum spiritual leader, but also transformed religion into an instrument of power, manipulating the beliefs of the people and traditions in their favor. Caesar's choice as a maximum pontiff was an episode that marked the pulse of his audacity. He faced much older rivals in prestige and experience, men who underestimated the ability of an ambitious young man who knew as few the secrets of persuasion. Caesar not only promised, but made the people believe that his victory was inevitable, appealing to his charisma and promising prosperity and protection under his leadership. The day of the vote, the streets of Rome were filled with crowds that chanted their name. That victory was not just politics, it was a show that showed how Caesar was able to mold the popular will. Converted into a maximum pontiff, Caesar used the position to build his image as an almost divine figure. Its official residence, the public domus, located next to the Roman Forum, became a nerve point where religious ceremonies, political speeches, and clandestine strategies were mixed. Caesar began to shape a myth around his person, presenting himself as a protector of traditions, but at the same time as a visionary who would bring a new order to Rome. In his role as a religious leader, Caesar orchestrated rituals and festivals with a level of splendor that Rome had never seen. He knew that pomp and theatricality captured the heart of the masses. Each ceremony became an act of propaganda, where citizens saw not only a political leader, but also a man chosen by the gods. With each public sacrifice, each carefully organized procession, Caesar strengthened their connection with the people and their control over them. The Senate, always vigilant, began to see with concern how Caesar used his position to consolidate his power. But he did not act impulsively. His strategy was meticulous, and knew when to act with diplomacy and when to impose himself. From his position as a maximum pontiff, he had access to religious machinery that regulated superstitions, omens, and calendars, tools he could use to influence the most crucial political decisions. At the same time, his career as a praetor led him to face more direct challenges. As a high-ranking magistrate, Caesar had the responsibility of managing justice and leading troops if necessary. It was at this stage where he demonstrated his ability to balance the interests of the people and the aristocracy, maintaining an appearance of legality while continued to consolidate his power. The judicial cases in which he often participated became public shows, where their brilliant rhetoric and their ability to connect with the emotions of the people were evidenced. The people of Rome saw a man who not only spoke, but acted. His proximity to citizens, his ability to listen to their concerns and turn them into tangible promises, distinguished him from other leaders. It was not uncommon to see him walking between the crowd, shaking hands, offering words of comfort or making promises that, although ambitious, resonated in the hearts of those who listened to them. However, his growing popularity did not go unnoticed by his enemies. In the corridors of the Senate and private meetings, murmurs about Caesar's excessive ambition began to grow. But he, with a serenity that baffled his adversaries, continued advancing, knowing that every step he took closer to his final destination. In his time as a maximum and praetor, Caesar not only demonstrated his ability to lead, but also his ability to transform any position into a power platform. His enemies watched him with distrust, while the people, increasingly convinced, began to see him as the only man capable of taking Rome towards a glorious future. And while the days passed, Caesar continued to rise, always with his eyes fixed on a horizon that few could imagine. The year 59 BC. He marked a milestone in the history of Rome, a moment in which politics was woven in the dark of the rooms of power, with a secret alliance that would forever change the fate of the Republic. Caesar, newly appointed consul, began to weave his network of alliances with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompeo, the great general who had gained glory in the lands of the East, and Crassus, the richest man in the city, owner of a fortune capable of tilting any balance. The formation of the first triumvirate, although never officialized, was the result of a pact made by closed doors. It was an alliance that challenged the traditional norms of Rome, an agreement that was not based on respect for the Senate or the will of the patricians, but on the ambition of three men who saw in the unity a unique opportunity to achieve absolute power. Caesar, aware that a consulate only did not grant him the control he wanted, managed to get Pompey and Crassus to join him in what would be a relationship of mutual benefit. Pompey, although he had reached fame and military respect, needed to ensure control of the lands of the East and veterans who had left there. As for Crassus, its main objective was to ensure its economic and political position, taking advantage of Caesar's influence to achieve control of the agrarian reforms that he wanted so much. The agreement was clear: Caesar would obtain the military support of Pompey and the wealth of Crassus, while these two men would have the Caesar alliance to ensure their own ambitions. The first triumvirate operated under a facade of friendship, but each of the three knew that the real objective was to achieve what Rome had denied them for years: absolute power. However, as expected in the turbulent Rome, the personal interests of each one soon began to overwhelm any idea of camaraderie. Caesar, with his political cunning, used his consulate of 59 BC to launch a series of agrarian reforms that would test the Senate resistance. These reforms, destined to distribute land among the veterans of Pompey and the poor of Rome, were seen as a direct attack on the traditional aristocracy. Caesar had managed to gain the sympathy of the people, but the patricians were not willing to let a plebe like him alter the order of the Republic. The Senate, headed by his most staunch enemies, vehemently opposed the reforms. The aristocrats feared that the redistribution of land would dilute their power, and considered Caesar as a man who challenged the very foundations of the Republic. The tensions rose quickly. The protests in the streets of Rome became common, and the Senate tried to block all the initiatives of Caesar. However, Caesar, with the help of Pompey and Crassus, not only managed to impose his reforms, but also showed that he could manage public opinion in his favor. Caesar's opponents in the Senate, baffled by their bold movement, tried to sabotage their plans in various ways. But Caesar, with his ingenuity and his charisma, managed to manipulate every situation in his favor, showing Rome that his struggle was not only for power, but for the welfare of the most needy. Thus, the figure of Caesar was consolidated as a defender of the lower classes, while his rivals looked more and more isolated. But behind the facade of reforms and promises of a better future for Rome was the game of power. Each of the triumvirate members had their own interests. Pompey wanted to ensure control of the East, and Crassus yearned for more power and wealth. Caesar, meanwhile, knew that, although the alliance granted him momentary control, the true battle was for absolute power, a power that could only achieve if he managed to eclipse his allies. Throughout his consulate, Caesar showed that he was not only a political strategist, but also a man who understood how to use public pressure and manipulation of the Senate to reach his ends. Agricultural reforms, although driven by Caesar, became a symbol of the struggle between the people and the elite, a reflection of the growing division in Rome. While the patricians were enraged, the people began to see a leader who was not afraid to challenge the powerful in his name. The first triumvirate, although successful on the surface, began to show cracks. Tensions between the three men were increasing, since each one sought their own benefit. Caesar, with his cunning, began to recognize that, although the allies were useful, it would always be he who had to take the reins of the future of Rome. The alliance, which at first seemed unwavering, was destined to crumble, and Caesar, unstoppable, continued to advance towards a destination that would lead him to the summit of Roman power. The consulate of 59 BC not only left a mark in Rome, it was also the first step of a path that Caesar would travel, with courage and ambition, until reaching the throne of the Roman Empire. However, what seemed like a victory for the people was far from being the end. The real challenge was about to arrive, and Caesar, with his sharp mind and his impetuous heart, knew that the battle for power was only beginning. The icy wind blew over the lands of northern Italy, where the shadows of the Alps seemed to monitor each movement. It was here, in the heart of Gaul Cisalpina, where Caesar would begin to forge his legend as a military leader. In 58 BC, when Caesar assumed command of this region as governor, the land was not a place of peace. The Gauls, indomitable and scattered, they were both a threat and an opportunity. But Caesar, more than any other man, knew that this mandate would be his test field, the land in which he would demonstrate not only his strategic ability, but his will of iron to conquer. Upon arriving at Gaul Cisalpina, Caesar was not yet the colossus that would be years later. He was a man who had proven to be a political cunning and a respected consulate, but his name did not yet resonate in every corner of the empire. However, his ambition was such that the weight of power yet to conquer was pushing him to act with an almost unstoppable determination. He knew that fate would not be kind to him if he did not take advantage of every moment. The region was full of challenges. The Gauls tribes, still affected by the recent Roman expansion, had not completely surrendered. In fact, the presence of Rome was seen by many as a threat, and the tensions between the Gauling peoples were about to explode at any time. However, Caesar was not only in a hostile land, but also had to deal with the ambitions of other generals who competed for the control of military power in Rome. Soon, the first conflict signs arrived. The Helvetio people, who lived north of Gaul Cisalpina, decided to migrate west, through Roman territory. This incursion was seen as a direct threat to the security of the Republic, and Caesar, without thinking, brought together their strength to deal with the Helvetios. The battles that followed were fast and brutal, and although the resistance was fierce, Caesar showed his tactical ability to impose an overwhelming victory. The Roman army, under his command, demonstrated a discipline and effectiveness that left an indelible brand in the Gauls tribes, who soon knew that this Roman leader was not only a skilled politician, but also a formidable warrior. The victory over the Helvetios not only consolidated Caesar's position in the region, but also made it clear that his ambition did not know limits. It did not take long to face new challenges, this time with the Germans, whose leader, Ariovisto, had invaded Gaul. The Germans represented a considerable threat, but Caesar did not hesitate to face them. In a fight in which the speed of Roman troops was decisive, Caesar defeated them, sending a clear message to the Gaulish tribes: Rome was not only prepared to defend itself, but also advance towards any territory that threatened their domain. Throughout these first campaigns, Caesar's tactical skills shone intensely. Each victory, each maneuver, seemed to be loaded with a force that not only overwhelmed its enemies, but also overwhelmed their own soldiers, who, with each battle, began to see it as an almost mythical figure. Caesar knew that to ensure the love and loyalty of his troops, he should be one more on the battlefield. And it was. He was not far behind, he did not hide in protected tents. He marched, fought and led, sharing tiredness, thirst, suffering of his men. With his presence, his troops felt that there was no enemy that could defeat them. But behind each victory and each campaign, Caesar had a much greater objective. These first battles were not only to demonstrate their skill as a leader, but they were the steps of a much larger plan. Each conquered territory gave him more prestige, more power, and approached him to the dream of a Rome where he was not simply one more, but the only one. The Gaulish peoples, frightened by the speed of the campaign, began to realize that Caesar was not simply another Roman general, but someone who played a much bigger game, one in which only the total victory would be sufficient. And so, while Gallic Cisalpina was filled with stories about the young consul who had trembled even the Germans, Caesar watched in silence, planning the following movement. What was to come was not just a series of military victories. It was a tour that would transform an ambitious man into a legend. The Gallia Cisalpina had been only the first step in a path that would not end until Caesar had absolute control of the Gaulish lands. But in each battle, each land won, every cavada trench, the figure of Caesar was consolidated as the leader Roma needed to face the chaos that was approaching. The first campaigns in Gaul Cisalpina marked only the beginning of a much greater conflict, one that would drag Caesar not only, but to whole Rome, towards a future of glory and chaos. Each victory, each campaign, was leaving a mark on history. And while Caesar looked at the horizon, he knew that his destiny, marked by the sword and strategy, had no limits. The roar of the war drums resonated by the vast forests and hills of Gaul. The year 58 BC marked the start of a conflict that would change the face of Europe forever. In the center of this storm was Julius Caesar, a man whose ambition burned as an inextinguishable flame, willing to conquer not only lands, but also the hearts of his troops and the fate of Rome. It all started with the Helvetios, a tribe that had decided to abandon their ancestral lands and undertake a massive migration towards new regions. This movement, although motivated by its own survival, threatened to destabilize Roman borders. Caesar, who never let an opportunity to consolidate his power, saw in this situation more than a military challenge. It was his time to demonstrate that Rome would not give in a span of land, and that he was the man destined to lead that defense. The first encounter with the Helvetios was a strategy and bold show. Caesar not only deployed his troops with impeccable precision, but also knew how to play with geography and resources in his favor. In the Battle of the Sena River, the Roman army surprised the Helvetios while crossing, unleashing a devastating attack that decimated migrants. But Caesar didn't stop there. With a fierce determination, he persecuted the survivors until they were forced to surrender, making sure that the lesson was clear: Rome would not tolerate challenges in their domains. However, the victory against the Helvetios was only the beginning. To the north of Gaul, another danger Cernia on Roman borders. The Germans, led by the charismatic and feared Ariovisto, had crossed the Rhine, seeking to settle in Gaulish lands. Ariovisto, a proud and fierce leader, had underestimated Caesar. But the Roman general was not a common enemy. His ability to manipulate both his allies and his enemies was equally lethal as his sword. Caesar first tried diplomacy, sending emissaries to negotiate with Ariovisto. But when the conversations broke, the war became inevitable. In a series of calculated maneuvers, Caesar managed to attract the Germans to a land that favored the Roman legions. The battle that followed was a display of brutality and tactics, in which the legions demonstrated why Rome was the most feared military power of antiquity. The Germans, although brave, could not resist the relentless Roman advance. Ariovistus was defeated, his dispersed troops, and the remains of his army pushed back to the Rhine. But the initial conquests were not only a military triumph, they also consolidated Caesar's position as an incomparable leader. Each victory reinforced its reputation among the legions, who followed him with an almost fanatic loyalty. Caesar shared his deprivations, marched next to them, and was always on the front line, willing to face the elbow danger with his men. This link, forged in the heat of the battle, would be one of its greatest strengths in the coming years. While the Gaulish tribes watched with fear and astonishment how Caesar's legions advanced, the figure of the Roman leader began to acquire almost mythical dyes. For some, he was a savior who brought order and stability to a fragmented region. For others, he was a ruthless conqueror who sought to submit the free peoples of Gaul under the Roman yoke. However, Caesar not only saw in these campaigns an opportunity for personal glory. He knew that every victory in Gaul was a message for Rome. There, in the capital, his political enemies expected anxious any error that could cost him his position. But with each tribe defeated and each ensured territory, Caesar accumulated not only military power, but also a narrative of invincibility that made it virtually untouchable. The Galatian lands, full of cordless rivers, dense forests and imposing mountains, became the theater of a war that not only defined a man, but an era. And although the battles against the Helvetios and the Germans were only the beginning, each step taken by Caesar in this conflict would resonate throughout the centuries as a testimony of their military genius and his insatiable ambition. While the dust of these first victories settled, Caesar knew that the real challenge was just beginning. The Gaulish tribes, although divided, still had the ability to join a common enemy. But Caesar did not fear the future. I expected him, ready to face him with the same ferocity with which he had faced the Helvetios and the Germans. What would come later would be even bigger, more brutal, and more definitive. The Gaul was about to burn, and Caesar, as always, would be in the center of the flames. The Gauls of Gaul seemed tinged with fire, while the Gaulish tribes, divided by centuries of rivalries and internal conflicts, finally found a leader capable of joining them. That leader was Vercingetorix, a number that would resonate as a cry of challenge in the annals of history. High, imposing, and with a look that could infuse value or fear, Vercingetorix became the spark that ignited a rebellion against Roman domain. In front of him was Julius Caesar, a man who did not know the word defeat. What followed was an epic confrontation that reached its climax in the Siege of Alesia, an event that would define the fate of Gaul and seal Caesar's legacy. The rebellion began with small spotlights that quickly expanded throughout Gaul. Vercingetorix, understanding that facing the Roman legions directly was suicidal, adopted a burned earth strategy. The villages were burned, the razed fields and the destroyed supplies to deprive the Roman resources of resources. Caesar, accustomed to rapid and decisive triumphs, found himself in a hostile territory where the enemy seemed to fade between trees and fog. But Caesar was not a man who crowded in the face of adversity. Each obstacle was for him a challenge that he had to overcome with cunning and determination. In this context, Vercingetorix made an error that would be fatal. He decided to take refuge with his strength in the strength of Alesia, a city located in an elevated hill and surrounded by rivers, apparently impregnable. Caesar, far from going back, saw in this situation a unique opportunity to destroy the heart of the Gaulish rebellion. What followed was a siege that would become a masterpiece of the military strategy. Caesar ordered his men to build a series of fortifications around Alesia. First, an internal line to block defenders, and then another external line to protect themselves from possible Gaulish reinforcements. These fortifications included deep, wooded wooden, and mortal traps designed to wear out the enemy. While the Romans worked tirelessly, the Gauls inside Alesia watched with despair how their hope of escaping faded with every day that passed. Hunger and despair began to seize the defenders of Alesia. Vercingetorix, determined to resist, sent messengers in search of reinforcements. The Gaulish tribes responded, gathering a massive army that marched to Alesia to break the fence. What followed was a titanic battle that challenged both logic and luck. From the walls of Alesia, the defenders launched furious attacks against the internal line of Roman fortifications, while the reinforcement army attacks the external line. Caesar, with a coldness that seemed almost superhuman, directed his troops on both fronts. To each Gallic war cry, he responded with precise orders, moving his legions as pieces on a chessboard. The battle reached its climax on a chaotic night, where the moon illuminated a field of blood and steel. At the critical moment, Caesar personally led a burden that broke the morale of Gauling reinforcements, forcing them to flee. At dawn, luck was thrown. Alesia remained fenced, and Vercingetorix understood that his cause was lost. In an act of honor and sacrifice, he left the fortress dressed in his most splendid armor and gave Caesar, throwing his weapons at the foot of the Roman general. For the Gauls, it was a moment of deep humiliation, for Caesar, an absolute triumph. But the victory in Alesia was not just a military victory. It was a statement that Rome was invincible, and that Caesar was the man destined to take her to the cusp of his glory. The Gaulish tribes, defeated and exhausted, submitted one by one, marking the end of the resistance organized in Gaul. While the legions dismantled the fortifications and the Roman banners waved on the conquered lands, Caesar allowed a brief moment of reflection. He knew that the victory in Alesia had elevated him to an almost divine status, but he was also aware that this triumph, like everyone else, would bring new challenges. In Rome, his political enemies expected anxious any opportunity to tear it down. However, Caesar was not a man who cared about the future. He was born to conquer, and Gaul, now under the control of Rome, was just another chapter in his insatiable search for greatness. The shadow of Alesia, however, would remain. The echoes of the Gala resistance and the tragic figure of Vercingetorix would never be forgotten. While Caesar prepared to return to Rome, he knew he had won more than a war. He had assured his place in history as one of the greatest strategists and leaders of all time. But what cost? Time would say it. Julio Caesar's genius did not only live in his ability to lead men on the battlefield, but also in his ability to mold minds and hearts, both of his soul attached to his enemies. He was not just a general, it was a strategist and a diplomat who understood that wars were not only won with swords, but also with carefully constructed words, symbols, and narratives. Caesar, always meticulous, understood from the beginning that war was a show as much as a confrontation. His military tactics were not only brilliant because of their effectiveness, but for their ability to inspire fear and admiration. I knew how to turn a simple maneuver into an epic theater act, how to transform a tactical victory into a moral victory that resonated beyond the battlefield. Their legions, disciplined and loyal to the core, became extensions of their will, precision machines that executed their orders with an almost religious fidelity. One of Caesar's most fascinating aspects as a strategist was his ability to anticipate the movements of the enemy and exploit them with a cunning that he often left his bewildered opponents. In Gaul, for example, not only faced warriors who knew every corner of their land, but also volatile alliances and unpredictable leaders. Caesar, however, did not seek to simply destroy, I was looking to divide. I played with the rivalries between the Gaulish tribes, offering alliance promises to some while crushing others, until the unit that Vercingetorix longed for crumbled like a castle of cards. But if on the battlefield it was relentless, in the sand of diplomacy its subtlety was equally lethal. Caesar knew that a humiliated enemy was a dangerous enemy, and therefore, instead of completely crushing the captured Gauling leaders, he sought to integrate them into the Roman system. Some offered titles, other lands, and the luckiest, the privilege of participating in their triumph returned to Rome as allies. This combination of punishment and reward allowed him to pacify Gaul without maintaining a permanent army in every corner of the conquered territory. However, Caesar did not limit himself to being a strategist and diplomatic in action, he also understood the power of the written word. While their soldiers built strengths or marched towards the next confrontation, Caesar dedicated the nights to write their comments on the Gallic War. These texts, more than simple chronic, were propaganda tools designed to glorify their achievements and justify their actions before the Senate and the Roman people. Caesar's mastery as a writer resided in his ability to transform the complexity of campaigns into clear, heroic, and deeply human narratives. He described the battles not only as acts of conquest, but as struggles for the survival of Rome against wild barbarians and betrayals. Each victory was a testimony of his genius and the discipline of his legions, while every setback, presented with a calculated humility, served to highlight his resilience and determination. In his comments, Caesar did not talk about himself in the first person. He referred to Caesar as if he were an external observer, an almost mythical figure whose greatness was evident in each line. This narrative style not only increased his aura of authority, but also allowed him to present himself as a man at the service of Rome, and not as a hungry leader of power. It was a masterful manipulation of public perception, a way to ensure that, when the time came to face his political enemies in Rome, he would have the people on his side. Meanwhile, the military tactics described in their writings were studied with astonishment both by their contemporaries and for future generations. From the construction of bridges in record time to the surround maneuvers that caught entire armies, Caesar demonstrated a creativity that challenged the conventions of the time. Each written line was a lesson of leadership, strategy, and boldness. But there was something else behind his words, something that could not be measured in numbers of legions or conquered territories. There was a man who understood the power of ideas, a leader who knew that the real battlefield was not in the hills of Gaul, but in the mind and heart of those who followed or judged him from distance. And so, while Caesar, strategist and diplomat, consolidated his domain in Gaul, in Rome they began to murmur their name with a mixture of admiration and fear. Each victory, each written story, each tribe submitted, added one more brick to the tower of its ambition. But also, every step he took approached him to the edge of an abyss that perhaps there would be no return. The Gaul War was coming to an end, but for Caesar, the real combat was just about to begin. The wind blew strongly that morning in Rome, as if the city itself presented omens of what was out of go. The corridors of the Senate, those corridors that had always been the place of the whispers and intrigues, now resonated with a palpable tension. It was not only politics that moved in that loaded air, but the fate of Rome. And everything, without knowing it, began to crumble. Caesar had reached the top, but his rise had a price that began to become increasingly evident. The relationship with Pompey, which had previously been an alliance of convenience, was now in ruins. A link that was forged in war, ambition, and mutual promises, was being undone for the death of Crassus, that other pillar of the triumvirate that had kept the balance of power in balance. Crassus, the businessman, the rich who thought that money bought everything, had fallen into battle in the fight against deliveries, in a campaign that was as disastrous as unexpected. His death was a deadly blow not only for him, but for the balance that Caesar and Pompey had achieved in their secret treatment. Without a Christ to mediate, the tensions between Pompey and Caesar became uncontrollable. The friendship that once had united them was just a shadow, and Roman politics prepared to change irrevocably. Caesar knew that Pompey, without the weight of Crassus to keep calm, would become more and more distant. And what had previously been a collaboration to build the power of Rome, now became a fierce competition, where only one could be victorious. Disputes between the two men became more and more intense, such as two gladiators who, before fighting, expected the right time to throw the first blow. But what Caesar had not completely anticipated was the strength of the Senate, an institution that until that time had been its ally. As soon as Pompey began to get closer to the Senate, the atmosphere in Rome became more hostile. The senators, always eager to keep their power and influence, saw a threat in Caesar. A man who had conquered Gaul, who had done with an almost absolute military power, who was preparing to challenge the status quo, could not be allowed. In his eyes, Caesar was no longer a war hero, but a shadow that darkened the greatness of Rome. And, for some, the only way to protect the freedom of the Republic was to strip Caesar from his power. The murmurs in the great Senate rooms became more audible, the decisions began to bow towards direct confrontation. Caesar, who until then had been praised for his cunning, was now facing a real challenge. What would he do when the same Republic had protected him betrayed him? The tension increased like a string that tense on the verge of rupture. The Senate, with his will to challenge Caesar's growing influence, began to emit decrees that limited his power. But Caesar was not a man who submitted without fighting. Like a lion surrounded by hyenas, he began preparing his answer. He knew that the battle for his future would not be won with diplomacy or with words, but with actions that resonated beyond the murmuring in the halls of power. Meanwhile, Pompey, who had lost his ally Crassus and saw that his power was now just an echo compared to Caesar's, was aligning with the Senate. As an enemy, he became an ally, but a dangerous ally. It rose as the figure of Rome that could stop the unstoppable advance of Caesar. Pompey's betrayal was slow, but sure. Far from being the friend who had been, he became a man who, in search of stability, was willing to do anything to tear down his former ally. The war was imminent. Rome prepared for a confrontation between two of their greatest children, men who once considered themselves brothers, but now they were on the edge of the abyss. Caesar's triumph in Gaul had been the prelude to his glory, but now his destiny was played in the hands of men who were willing to strip him of everything. The Senate, by pressing Caesar, thought he controlled the situation, but did not understand the magnitude of what was about to unleash. Caesar, seeing that things became irreconcilable, prepared to march to Rome with his legions, challenging the mandate of the Senate, with the power of an army of men willing to follow him until the end of the world. Thus, Roman politics became a watchmaking bomb. Each word, every decision, each look between Caesar and Pompey, between Caesar and the Senate, went beyond politics and became a struggle for the very soul of Rome. What began as an ambition and power society was falling apart in the eyes of all. What nobody knew was that, in Caesar's heart, uncertainty also weighed. But he had no choice. The men who had once supported him, now he turned they saw their enemies. The loyalty of the legions, its last refuge, would be tested in the crudest way. And while Rome prepared for a civil war, Caesar could only look at the horizon, where the future of the Republic was intertwined with his own destiny. The night had fallen over central Italy, and silence was only interrupted by the sound of military boots marching to a firm, determined step. At that moment, the future of Rome was suspended in the air, waiting for the decision of a single man. Caesar was facing the Rubicon, a seemingly insignificant river that separated the provinces of the Gaul from Italy itself. But this small river was not just a physical obstacle, it was a symbolic border, a red line that, if crossed, would mean the rupture of an entire era. Alia iacta ist. The words, loaded with historical weight, resonated in Caesar's mind. Luck is thrown. It was the phrase he delivered when making the decision that would change the course of the history of Rome and the entire world. That was not only one step on the Rubicon, but a leap towards the unknown, a challenge to everything that the Republic represented. When crossing it, Caesar committed to the civil war. There was no turning back. With the look fixed, as if he could see beyond the limits of darkness, Caesar was not only facing a river. He was making a decision that would transform Rome into a battlefield, a place where friends would become enemies and where the former allies would fight for what was left of the Republic. His army, determined to follow him, advanced with him. Behind each step, each soldier, there was a promise, the promise of a radical change, the promise of a man who fought not only for power, but for the survival of his own vision of Rome. The Rubicon, in its nature, was just a small stream. But, for Caesar, he represented the last border, the last barrier between what had been and what could be. Crossing it was more than a simple physical act. It was a statement, one that would resonate over the centuries. For centuries, Rome had been a republic, governed by the Senate, where power was destined to share it among citizens and their leaders. But when crossing the Rubicon, Caesar was challenging that structure and sending a message to Rome: power is no longer distributed between the people and the elites. Power was now his. And while progressing, the Rubicon became more than a river. For Caesar, it was a metaphor of life itself. That step represented a crossroads, a point without return where decisions could not be undone. Every step that took on that conquered earth was marked by an irrevocable destiny. The civil war was not just an army's war, it was a struggle for the very soul of Rome, for the right to define what it meant to be Roman, what it represented to be a leader, what place the citizens occupied in the great machinery of power. But there was something else at that cross of the Rubicon, something deeper and more sinister. It was the fate of a city, of a civilization that had grown beyond its original borders. Rome, that city built on the ashes of ancient empires and resurfaced through conquests, would not be the same after this civil war. The cracks that had already begun to form between the Senate and the popular, between Caesar and Pompeo, would now become deeper, until the earth itself trembled under the weight of the war. the soldiers who marched with Caesar knew what was at stake. Some, with the mindset in the past victories, knew that the future of Rome not only depended on Caesar, but on his loyalty. As they crossed the Rubicon, they entered an uncertain territory. The story of Rome, with his glorious republican tradition, was in his hands. They were willing to risk everything for an uncertain future because they knew that at this time, luck was not on anyone. What nobody knew at that moment was that the crossing of the Rubicon would be only the beginning. The civil war would be long, heartbreaking, full of intrigues and betrayals. But it would also be a war where Caesar would demonstrate that his vision of Rome was stronger than any loyalty to the former republic. And while their legions advanced, the echoes of the decisive step resonate in the streets of Rome could be heard, where the future of the city began to be written with blood and fire. The Rubicon, small and unimportant for many, became the symbol of a transformation that would mark not only the history of Rome, but of the whole known world. The crossing of that river not only meant the declaration of war, but Caesar's consecration as the man who dismantled the old Rome, to build a new one. The Roman Republic, as they knew it, would no longer exist. The air in Italy was loaded with tension, like heaven will wait for the battle that would mark the fate of the Republic. The civil war had begun, and the heart of Rome was beating with the sound of the armies that faced each other. Caesar, who had crossed the Rubicon with the firmness of a man who did not know fear, now led his army with an even more fierce determination. In front of him, Pompey, the once ally, was now his most feared enemy, the man who had been his friend and partner in the triumvirate, but who had decided to challenge him for the control of Rome. The battlefield extended to them, and with each step they took, the story was woven with blood and sweat. Pompey's forces, who had taken refuge in southern Italy, were great and well organized, but Caesar did not doubt their strategy. He knew that the value and loyalty of his troops could overcome any obstacle. It was not only the struggle for power that was at stake, but the future of Rome, the city that he dreamed remodeling in his image and likeness. The first skirmishes were intense, fast, and Pompey seemed to have the advantage in some moments. But Caesar, the man who had crossed the Rubicon without looking back, was not someone who would give up so easily. With cunning, he managed to advance through Italy, gaining ground in each confrontation. Meanwhile, Pompey retired east, hoping to regroup and give a definitive battle. But Caesar had no intention of leaving him time to reorganize his strength. The Battle of Pharsalia, however, would be the scenario where everything would change. The Pharsalia plain became the witness of one of the most decisive confrontations in history. There, Caesar, with his reduced but determined army, faced Pompey's forces. The battle was fierce, a clash of titans, where it was decided not only the fate of two men, but the future of an entire civilization. The sun rose on the battlefield, illuminating the faces of the soldiers, who knew that day would not go back. Caesar's legions, despite being in numerical inferiority, fought with a fierce loyalty to his commander, convinced that victory could only be his. Caesar had trained his men to be fast, cunning and, above all, to follow him until the end. Each movement of his troops was meticulously planned, a precision dance that was developing rapidly. Pompey, on the other hand, trusted his numerical strength and his experience, but something inside him already doubted. While the forces were in combat, it seemed that something inside was broken. The man who once had been a hero of Rome, the man who had commanded the legion successfully, saw how his dream crumbled. The Battle of Pharsalia, that which decided the civil war, was also the one that would mark the fall of Pompey. And it was precisely at that time, when fate seemed to bow in favor of Caesar, which Pompey made his last mistake. Seeing how his forces fell after another, his confidence in his victory began to crumble. Fear seized him, and with his heart full of uncertainty, he decided to flee. His army, now scattered and without a leader, was easy for Caesar's forces. Pompey, a figure that had been synonymous with greatness in Rome, fled the battlefield, leaving behind his soldiers, his dreams, and his dignity. While his horse galloped towards the horizon, the echo of his defeat was heard in every corner of Rome. Caesar, meanwhile, advanced mercilessly. His victory in Pharsalia was not only a military triumph, but an irrefutable proof of his strategic genius. Rome, the old Rome, had fallen into her hands. But the victory in Pharsalia was not a clean ending. Pompey's flight took him to Egypt, where he would find his tragic destiny. There, on the Nile coast, the man who once was his rival would be caught by the intrigues of an Egyptian court that did not understand the complexities of the Roman civil war. And while Pompey died, the road to Caesar's absolute power cleared. The civil war, although not yet finished, had decided on that battlefield. The shadows of Republican Rome faded while a new era began to take shape. The warm wind of the Egyptian desert blew gently on the coast of the Nile, while the fate of Rome and the empire that Caesar dreamed governing took an unexpected turn. Egypt, with its great civilization, was a world completely different from that of ancient Rome, but was also mired in its own struggle for power. Cleopatra, the young queen of Egypt, was at a political crossroads, seeking to consolidate her reign while fighting her brother Ptolemy XIII on the throne. In the midst of this chaos, the fate of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra crossed, transforming their lives and, without knowing it, changing the course of history. Caesar, after his victory in the Battle of Pharsalia, pursued Pompey to Egypt, where intrigues and conspiracies were waiting for him. Pompey's murder at the hands of the Egyptians was a cruel and humiliating blow to a man who had been so great. But instead of being dragged by the pain of the defeat of his former rival, Caesar found himself face to face with a much more complex situation. In Egypt, the young Cleopatra fought to survive in a court full of betrayals, and although she was queen, she did not have total control of her kingdom. Caesar, with the cunning of an experienced strategist, quickly recognized that joining Cleopatra could be the key to consolidating his power in the region. Thus began one of the most famous political and personal alliances in history, a union that would transcend the borders of power and politics. However, this relationship was not only a game of alliances, but also a meeting of souls. Cleopatra, with her undeniable intelligence and charm, captivated Caesar in a way that few could. In that meeting between Caesar and Cleopatra, more than politics began to take shape. While Rome lived its internal chaos, Cleopatra offered Caesar something that neither the glory nor the absolute power of Rome could give him: their trust, their unconditional support, and a vision of a shared future. She was not only a queen with political ambitions, but also a woman willing to risk everything to ensure her power and that of her lineage. Caesar, on the other hand, saw in it an invaluable ally, a woman capable of challenging conventions and using her cunning to change the course of history. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra was rapidly consolidated. Together, they joined strength to defeat the enemies of the queen in Egypt, which allowed Cleopatra to recover control of the throne. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra shared not only power, but also a passion that grew beyond politics. In the luxurious cuts of the Palace of Alexandria, Caesar immersed himself in an exotic world, full of old wealth, secrets, and rituals that offered him a new perspective of life. The woman who had conquered her heart was not only a queen, but an enigma that challenged him to look beyond Rome, to understand that the world was bigger than he had imagined. Caesar's return to Rome was marked by a fact that nobody would forget: the son Cleopatra gave him. That child, Caesarion, although he was not Caesar's first heir, represented something much bigger. In his veins he ran the blood of Rome, but also that of Egypt. The union between Caesar and Cleopatra had not only been a political alliance, but a blood bond that challenged the norms of the time. Rome, who had been built on the power of the Senate and aristocratic families, now had to face the idea that the future of his empire could depend on a child born in distant lands. Cleopatra, on the other hand, knew that her relationship with Caesar not only assured her on the throne of Egypt, but also positioned her as one of the most influential figures of her time. Meanwhile, Caesar, despite his victories and his indisputable power, knew that his time in Egypt had been a turning point. The relationship with Cleopatra had been a temporary escape from the pressures of Rome, a place where he could be himself, where he did not have to fight for his life every day, as he did in the Roman political arena. However, the story of Caesar and Cleopatra was not just a story of power and love. As Caesar returned to Rome, the murmurs about their relationship with the Egyptian queen grew. The Roman senators, always suspicious of the power that Caesar accumulated, saw in their connection with Cleopatra a threat. The voices of those who wanted to recover the control of Rome began to raise their voices, and Caesar's fate, so sure until that moment, began to crumble. In Egypt, meanwhile, Cleopatra continued to consolidate his power, governing with the cunning of a queen who knew that, in politics, the loyalties could change with the same speed with which the desert wind blew. His link with Caesar had not only given him the throne, but also an influence in Rome that few could imagine. However, what began as a political and personal alliance became a relationship that would lead Caesar to a crossroads that he would not have anticipated. The presence of Cleopatra in the life of Caesar, his son, and his legacy would become symbols of a Rome that, in his splendor, was about to get lost in the shadows of history. Rome was facing an irreversible turn. The city, always governed by its traditional institutions, such as the Senate, the consuls, and the magistrates, was being shaken by a figure that seemed to challenge all the conventions. Caesar, after crossing the Blonde, had drawn an invisible line E, a border of which there would be no return. The man who once had been only one more among the greats of Rome, now erected himself as the pillar on which the fate of the empire rested. But, beyond the military victories, of the glory obtained in the campaigns, its true transformation of Rome did not come from the battlefield, but from the radical reforms that many of them implemented, born of their personal vision of what Rome it must be. The figure of the dictator, in a temporary principle, was soon consolidated as the axis around which everything revolved. Caesar was not only a ruler, but the incarnation of absolute power. In his hands the total control of Roman politics rested, and although he seemed to act under the appearance of a restoration of the Republic, in his heart he knew that Rome would never be the same again. The reforms he implemented were the clear evidence of his intention to reorganize the political, social, and economic system of the Eternal City, leaving behind the structures they had made of Rome what it was. In the political sphere, the centralization of power was evident. Caesar, when taking control, stripped the Senate of much of his authority. It was no longer a free Senate where the aristocrats discussed the fate of Rome. Under Caesar's leadership, the Senate became an extension of the dictator's power. The ancient magistrates lost the real decision capacity, and the Roman people began to look at Caesar not as a first citizen in equals, but as their only savior. The dictator's figure, initially thought of as something temporary, became something that seemed to last. Rome, under his firm hand, lived a period of radical reforms that, for the most part, sought to stabilize an empire that crumbled under the weight of the old structures. The social reforms, however, were the ones that really made the difference. Caesar understood that the future of Rome could not rest only in the noble patricians, in the senators who had been in power for generations. The people, the lower classes, and the commoners, had to be heard and treated. The agrarian reforms were some of the most prominent, since it redistributed lands of the nobles to the veteran soldiers and the poorest, something that gave them not only a livelihood, but also a sense of belonging and loyalty to Caesar. It was not only an act of social justice, but a way to strengthen its support base. In addition, he reformed the wheat distribution system, ensuring that the plebe had access to cheap and insurance foods, which further consolidated its popularity among the masses. In the economic field, Caesar implemented a series of tax reforms that sought to relieve the loads of the poorest citizens, but also increase the income of the state. He reduced taxes on the lower classes and strengthened the collection structures to avoid the corruption that had characterized the previous governments. But beyond the simple economic policy, Caesar showed a pragmatic vision of the empire. He knew that the money that entered the coffers of Rome should be used effectively to maintain control over the vast territory that Rome had conquered. Therefore, he did not spare in resources to finance the legions and guarantee peace at the borders, while promoting public works projects that would improve the city's infrastructure. However, it was in the reform of the judicial system where its centralization of power was more clearly. Caesar created a more accessible and efficient judicial system, which eliminated many of the corrupt influences of the past. The courts became more equitable, and their control over the legal system allowed him to ensure that his decrees were enforced. But the most significant reform was the creation of new laws that favored their followers, those who supported it unconditionally. This political maneuver strengthened its network of loyalty and dependencies, ensuring that Rome was a city governed not by a series of decentralized institutions, but by a single man with absolute control over all aspects of Roman life. But Caesar also showed an exceptionally pragmatic character in his approach to the old Roman traditions. He did not completely reject the values of the Republic, but adapted them to their own purposes. It was appointed perpetual dictator, but, at the same time, it was presented as the protector of Roman customs and traditions, a defender of republican morals. With this, he tried to appease those who feared that their reforms endangered the very essence of what Rome represented. In his vision, however, the Republic was not something that should remain immutable. Rome should evolve if I wanted to remain great. The problem, like many saw it, it was that Caesar's reforms, although necessary, also represented a direct threat to the stability of the traditional institutions of Rome. The Senate, whose influence had been undermined by Caesar's growing power, could not accept his absolute authority. As the months passed, the tension between the figure of the dictator and the senators became increasingly palpable. Many of the ancient aristocrats felt that their power was being raised, and their fear that Caesar would turn Rome into a monarchy, although not without reason, fed hatred towards him. Each decree that Caesar signed, every reform he implemented, seemed to bring him closer to an end that he did not see coming. The Rome of the senators, of the patricians, and of the traditional nobility, was no longer the same. Caesar had transformed everything around him, and his vision of Rome, although great and pragmatic, was the resistance of those who were not willing to give up their privileges. Without knowing it, Caesar was walking on a tightrope. The sun was beginning to get on the distant lands of the east, when Caesar, with his look fixed on the horizon, received the news that the kingdom of the Bosphorus, led by Pharnaces II, had raised against Rome. The threat was serious, and although the challenges multiplied in the vast empire, Caesar did not hesitate for a moment. He was a man who did not know fear, a man who was willing to conquer until the last corner of the known world, and the east was just one more stage in his unstoppable ascent. Upon arriving in Asia Minor, Caesar faced a large and well-prepared army, but the story of Rome was marked by the ability of its generals, and Caesar was not going to be the exception. What happened in Zala was something so fast, so precise, that he left the world speechless. The battle was a real example of Caesar's military skill, a fulminating fight that was fought in just a few days. The speed with which he defeated Pharnaces II, a formidable king, showed the entire world that Caesar was not only a strategist, but a man with the gift of war. With an impeccable tactic, Caesar surrounded his enemy at the precise moment, cutting his access to any type of escape. The crash of swords, the creak of the horses on the ground, the crash of the cries of war, everything happened with such speed that it seemed to be nothing more than a storm that swept the enemy without mercy. The Bosphorus, a kingdom that had once challenged Rome, was destroyed in the blink of an eye. There was no mercy, there was no doubt. Pharnaces II was forced to flee, but his defeat was inevitable. Caesar's response when facing this challenge was as resounding as it is blunt: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I won. 3 words that summarized not only the outcome of the battle, but also Caesar's character. There were no doubts or complications, only victory. Caesar's war cry resonated throughout Rome, a declaration of absolute power, a clear message to all those who doubted their strength and determination. Caesar's words became a legend, a reminder that the Roman dictator was not only a man of words, but a man of action, a man whose strength not only was his ability to plan, but in his ability to make each battle a victory that would be recorded in the collective memory of Rome. The campaign against Pharnaces II was a quick, but significant victory. By defeating a formidable enemy in such a short time, Caesar further consolidated his authority. Rome not only had a military leader, he had a man who seemed invincible. His reputation, already impressive, grew even more, and the provinces of the East began to recognize their power as never before. Zala's victory was not simply a military conquest, it was an affirmation of Caesar's absolute power, a sign that no kingdom, no enemy, could challenge the strength of Rome and survive. In Rome, the news of victory spread like a fire. Caesar had been able to defeat Pharnaces II in the blink of an eye, and his triumph became one of the most impressive feats of his career. The phrase Veni, Vidi, Vici began to be repeated by the Romans, a symbol of his greatness. For many, he not only meant the victory over an enemy, it meant the consolidation of his power. Caesar had not only won on the battlefield, he had conquered the hearts and minds of the Romans. His name resonated in all the streets, in every corner of the city. However, beyond the immediate glory of victory, what was at stake was much more. Each of these victories of Caesar was a step more in its rise to the top, a path that could no longer stop. The victory over Pharnaces II was not just a military triumph, it was one a downgraph to all who opposed their power. Caesar was not only an exceptional leader, but a man whose destiny seemed inevitable. His victory in Zala was, therefore, one more piece on the chessboard that Caesar was playing with the world, and every time, he seemed to get closer to his goal. Caesar returned from the campaign of the East as a hero, but under that layer of glory, there was something else. The victory had been fast, but it had also been brutal. The war, although it cuts, had left his mark, and the man who returned to Rome was no longer the same as he had left. In his eyes there was a new look, a look that showed that the man who had conquered East was now prepared to face even greater challenges. And while Rome celebrated his victory, a persistent question floated in the air: who could stop a man who had achieved so much in such a short time? The war in Africa was one of those stories that left a bitter taste, as if the weight of lost lives was impregnated in every corner of the continent. After the defeat of Pompey, the army of the Pompeians retired south, seeking refuge on the coast of Africa, where they still maintained some power. It was a distant place, but not distant enough to escape from Caesar's calculating gaze. The peace he had achieved with his previous victory was about to fall apart. And with it, its determination to consolidate its power in Rome. It was not just about defeating Pompeians, but of ending any vestige of opposition that could threaten the greatness of his reign. The Pompeianist army, led by the son of Pompey, 6th Pompey, and the leader of the African forces, Juba I of Numidia, had met with the hope of giving a last blow. They knew that, if they did not defeat Caesar, Rome would become a world governed by him, and they, only in shadows of the past. The campaign began under a scorching sun, with the sound of the hulls of the horses resonating in the hot air of Africa. The tension grew while the troops approached the city of Tapso, a small but important town in the region, turned into the last bastion of Caesar's enemies. For him, the Battle of Tapso would not only be another fight, it would be the proof that there would be nothing or anyone who could oppose his power. The confrontation was fierce, and Caesar's forces, despite being numerically lower, were more organized and better trained. On the other side, the Pompeians, desperate, struggled to maintain their last hope. The soldiers of Juba and the Pompeians did not easily yield, but Caesar's strategy demonstrated their value once again. The battle was brutal and bloody, with each side fighting with a fury that can only be understood when survival is at stake. Caesar's forces, with their impeccable discipline, advanced with overwhelming force, while the Pompeians, exhausted and cornered, tried to resist everything they had left. The fight in Tapso was a deadly dance, a confrontation that defined the fate of many. The shouts of the fallen echoed among the ruins, while Caesar, with a fixed and determined look, saw how their army imposed slowly. Caesar's victory was decisive. In a confrontation that seemed to have no end, his troops broke the enemy lines, and the fall of Tapso was inevitable. The son of Pompey and Juba I were captured, and with them, the last vestiges of resistance in Africa were erased. There was nothing left to oppose the unstoppable advance of Caesar, neither in the African land nor on the horizon of Rome. What followed the Battle of Tapso was a series of consequences that left an indelible brand. The victory in Africa not only meant the elimination of a military threat, but also a clear message to all corners of the empire: Caesar was now unquestionably the leader of Rome. Not only had he won in Italy, he had not only crushed Pompey, but also made it clear that no corner of the empire would be safe enough for those who wanted to challenge his power. The victory of Tapso changed the course of Roman history in an irreversible way. The opponents were subjected, the broken alliances, and Rome, with Caesar in command, seemed stronger than ever. But while celebrating his victory in Africa, something dark began to cloud the dictator's mind. It was no longer just about winning wars or accumulating territories. Caesar had crossed a threshold, and what he had left behind could not be undone. Although at that time Tapso's victory seemed to consolidate his power, the price of that victory, and what would come later, would be much greater than anyone could foresee. The victory over the Pompeians in Africa was, for Caesar, a personal and political victory, but it was also the last chapter of a war that he had marked Rome forever. The echo of that victory resonated not only in the battlefields, but in the halls of power, where the future of Rome seemed to be completely in the hands of a single man. In the days after Tapso, while the African sun put slowly, Rome prepared for an even more uncertain future, but one that, in some way, was already marked by the name of Caesar. Under the abrasor solda Hispania, the earth seemed to burn with the intensity of an imminent struggle. Caesar, now in the height of his power, prepared to face one of the most bloody and decisive battles of his life, the Battle of Munda. Despite all his previous victories, he knew that this confrontation would not be simple. He faced the remains of the Pompeian army, led by the children of Pompey, Cneo and Sixth, who had gathered considerable force and clung to their last hope of challenging the Roman dictator. The battlefield in Munda, a high and strategic land, presented a complicated challenge for Caesar's troops. From the hills, the Pompeians watched with determination, while the Caesarian forces advanced with a mixture of discipline and anxiety. It was March of the year 45 BC, and in the air a sensation of imminent catastrophe floated. Both sides knew that the fate of Rome would be decided in those distant lands. The battle began with a deafening clash, a roar that seemed to shake the same land. The Pompeians, with the advantage of the high position, launched a shower of projectiles on Caesar's troops, forcing them to move cautiously. But Caesar, with his characteristic tactical intuition, personally directed his men, leading them from the front. With a red cape that highlighted him in the tumult, he inspired his soldiers not to go back. His presence in the field was a reminder that, even in chaos, Caesar was the force that guided them. The battle quickly became a brutal confrontation melee. The swords collided, the shouts of the injured were mixed with the rumble of the helmets and the clamor of the shields. Sweat and blood covered the men on both sides, while the terrain was dyed red. The resistance of the Pompeians was fierce, and at times, it seemed that Caesar's army could stagger. But their determination, together with the impeccable discipline of their troops, kept them firm. Caesar observed how his men struggled desperately, and he himself threw himself into combat, wielding his sword and directing strategic attacks that gradually broke the enemy lines. But Pompey's children did not give up easily. Cneo and Sixth fought with a courage that seemed to challenge even logic, leading their troops with a fervor that almost matched Caesar's. However, the tactical superiority of the dictator soon began to tip the balance. The decisive moment came when a Pompeian flank began to collapse under the pressure of the Caesarian attack. Caesar's soldiers took advantage of the gap and lashed out with a renewed force, cutting the enemy lines and separating them into small groups. Pompeian resistance crumbled slowly, and what was previously an organized army became chaos of men who fled or fought desperately for their lives. The battle ended with a decisive victory for Caesar, but at a high cost. He knew that this was a definitive victory, that with the defeat of the Pompeians in Munda, any threat to his power had been eliminated. But I also knew that the price of that victory was more than lost lives. It was a brand in his soul, a proof that even the greatest of men could not escape the shadows that the war left behind. With the victory in Hispania, Caesar became the undisputed Lord of Rome. But while he returned to the city, a question persisted: what else could conquer a man who already had everything? The answer, hidden in the shadows of the future, stalked like a storm that had not yet arrived. In bustling Rome, where the streets resonated with the echo of thousands of voices and the forum vibrated with political discussions, a man was erected above all: Julius Caesar. He was no longer only the victorious general or the cunning political leader, but something else, something that he was deeply resonated in the minds and hearts of his people. The Senate, that body full of pride and resentment, had proclaimed Caesar as perpetual dictator, an unprecedented position in the history of Rome, an invisible crown that weighed as much as the hopes of those who venerated him and the fears of those who hated him. The appointment did not arrive without resistance. In the Senate cameras, the looks of disdain and the whispered discussions painted a gloomy panorama. How had a single man arrived to concentrate so much power? The most conservatives murmured that Caesar had betrayed the ideals of the Republic, while his followers saw him as the only one capable of restoring order in a fractured world by war and corruption. But Caesar, imperturbable, advanced with a vision that did not stop at criticism or danger. Among its boldest reforms was the restructuring of the calendar, a measure that, although practical, symbolized its desire to control even the time itself. The Roman calendar, messy and confusing, became the Julian calendar, a more precise system that reflected the solar cycle. For Caesar, adjusting the days and months was not just a matter of functionality, it was an act of order, an affirmation that Rome, under his guide, could even master the irregularities of the cosmos. Meanwhile, in the city and its surroundings, infrastructure reforms began to change the face of Rome. Bridges, temples, forums, and theaters arose as witnesses to Caesar's ambition to transform the city into the jewel of the ancient world. Each stone placed, each column erected, seemed to whisper the same promise: Rome will be eternal. Under his direction, the Tiber, so chaotic in his overflows, was domesticated with projects that sought to prevent flooding and optimize access to water. Caesar understood that a large city could not prosper without a well-managed heart, and in Rome, that heart was its infrastructure. However, behind each monumental work there was a shadow of controversy. The most traditional patricians, those who saw in Caesar a threat to their power, accused the reforms of being a populist show. They said that their gifts to the people, from public shows to grain distributions, were calculated strategies to consolidate their power. But for the crowd, the man who gave them bread and entertainment was a savior, someone who had finally heard his needs and acted accordingly. Despite his position, Caesar did not limit himself to governing from an invisible throne. He walked among his people, listened to his concerns, and often he was accessible, as if he wanted to remind Rome that he had not forgotten his roots. But that closeness, that magnetism, did nothing but exacerbate the tensions between him and those who believed that a man should not have so much power. In the background, Caesar knew that his perpetual dictator title was not eternal. His always active mind contemplated not only what he could achieve in life, but what he would leave behind. He had begun to outline plans to expand Roman citizenship to more provinces, to ensure that Rome was not only a city dominating a vast territory, but an empire where all its inhabitants, from Hispania to Egypt, felt part of something bigger. But with each step he took, with each reform and project, the distance between him and his enemies became more abysmal. The nights in Rome, illuminated by torches and the whisper of conspiracies, were a reminder that absolute power also attracts absolute danger. Caesar, although aware of this, seemed not to fear it. For him, greatness could not separate from risk, and his ambition did not know limits. The story of Rome was being written with each of its movements, but the end of that story began to form in the shadows. In the heart of Rome, where the marble of the temple shone under the sun and the echoes of the crowds filled the forum, Julius Caesar was not only a man. It was something else, something that transcended his mortal flesh, a live myth. His presence dominated not only the streets, but also the minds of those who spoke their name in whispers of admiration or fear. Caesar, the strategist, the legislator, the conqueror, had woven his history with threads of reality and legend, to the point that it was impossible to separate the man from the myth. One of the most captivating elements of this transformation was his statement to descend directly from the gods. Caesar presented himself as a descendant of Venus genetics, the goddess of love and fertility, through Aeneas, the Trojan hero who, according to tradition, had founded the lineage of the Romans. This divine connection was not just an ornament for it. Each currency in the hands of a Roman citizen was a tangible reminder of the connection between Caesar and the favor of the gods. It was as if, when sustaining those pieces of silver or bronze, the people touched a fragment of the heavenly power he represented. But Caesar's personality cult was not limited to official propaganda. In Rome, statues began to emerge that showed him as a half-Lingion, with attributes that remembered both mortals and immortals. In the Caesar Forum, a temple dedicated to Venus genetics reinforced this divine association. It wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a monument to the myth of Caesar, a space where the earthly and the divine were in perfect harmony. The people, fascinated by their charisma, contributed to the growth of their legend. Rumors about his courage, his generosity and his strategic ingenuity spread rapidly. They said that Caesar could foresee the course of a battle just by observing the terrain, that he had superhuman resistance and that his voice could inspire the most demoralized soldiers. These stories, although often exaggerated, cemented the idea that he was not a common leader. However, this construction of the myth also had a price. The more he rose to Caesar to a position close to divinity, the more he distanced himself from the republican ideals that many Romans still valued. Some saw him as a savior, but others considered him a tyrant who had sacrificed the republic at the altar of his ambition. His enemies murmured that no man, no matter how much he claimed to descend from Venus, had the right to concentrate so much power. And yet, Caesar seemed imperturbable. Perhaps he believed that the story was on his side, that the coming centuries would remember not criticism, but their achievements. In his mind, the connection with Venus was not a simple symbol, it was a truth that justified his place in history. He was not just a man who ruled Rome, it was a being destined to transform it, to take it to a new level of glory that would resonate through the ages. But in the streets of Rome, where the voices mixed with the sounds of the markets and the rumors ran like rivers, the question persisted: Caesar was a mortal blessed by the gods, or a man who had learned to use the myth as your most powerful weapon? The atmosphere in Rome had become dense, as if the same air presages a tragic outcome. In the streets, rumors circulated with the speed of lightning. In the houses of the nobles and in the dark corners of the Senate, the whispers on conspiracies and betrayals were impossible to silence. Julius Caesar, the man who had shaped Rome in his image, walked to a destination that seemed written in the same tissues of the cosmos. The tensions had reached an unbearable point. Many senators saw in Caesar not a savior, but to a tyrant who had destroyed the Republic. The title of perpetual dictator, granted by the Senate itself, was a dagger nailed to the hearts of those who still dreamed of the days of the Republic. The centralization of power in their hands, the reforms that undermined control of the patricians, and the perception that Caesar was looking for a crown had inflamed the spirits. For some, the only solution was to eliminate it. Among the conspirators, two names shone with intensity: Marco June Gross and Caio Casio Longino. Gross, in particular, was a figure wrapped in contradictions. Caesar had treated him as a son, had trusted him, had raised him. However, the republican ideals that Gross shared with Casio were stronger than any personal bond. Casio, cunning and full of resentment, channeled those tensions in a plot that would take shape in the days prior to the Ides of March. The days before the fateful date were marked by disturbing auguries. The stories about divine signals multiplied. A blind man in the forum had shouted that Caesar had to take care of the March Ides. His wife, Calpurnia, disturbed by terrifying dreams in which he saw Caesar bleeding in the arms of Rome, begged him not to leave home. Even the augurs, to the realizer sacrifices, found anomalies in the bowels of animals, a misfortune. However, Caesar, confident in his destiny and dismissing superstitious fears, chose to ignore them. The Senate, the scenario of what was about to happen, was a place full of symbolism. There the destinations of Rome had decided for centuries, and there the conspirators would meet, not with words or votes, but with hidden daggers under their robes. Ides's day came, and with him, a disturbing calm that seemed to presage storm. Caesar, despite the warnings, decided to attend the session. Along the way, he met Artemidoro, a teacher who gave him a parchment. In it, as they say, the names of the conspirators and the plans to kill him were detailed. But Caesar, distracted by the bustle of the citizens who were looking for their attention, did not read it. The parchment was forgotten in his hands, a tragic symbol of lost opportunities to change his destiny. In the Senate, conspirators moved as shadows. Casio was nervous, but determined. Gross, more serene, seemed to debate between duty and betrayal. When Caesar entered, the senators rose in respect, a gesture that hid their true intentions. Soon, they surrounded him with banal excuses, pretending requests. In an instant, the daggers were unleashed, and the living room became chaos of screams, blood and steel. Caesar, the man who had faced armies, who had crossed the Rubicon, was now helpless at the blows of those who once trusted. According to the chronicles, he tried to defend himself, but soon understood the magnitude of betrayal. And it was then, seeing Brutus among the attackers, when he stopped resisting. "You too, my son?" they say he murmured before falling to the ground. His blood stained the slabs of the Senate, marking the end of an era. While Caesar lay lifeless, the conspirators did not celebrate. A cloud of uncertainty and fear hovered over them. Had they released Rome, or had their destiny sealed towards more chaos and violence? Outside, the people still did not know that the man who had governed our god had been betrayed as a man. The Pompey Theatre, majestic and solemn, housed that day a destination that would forever change the history of Rome. The architecture of the place, with its marble columns and wide galleries, seemed indifferent to the drama that was about to develop. There, under the shadow of the statue of Pompey, the man who once was his rival, Julius Caesar, headed for his last confrontation. The conspirators, led by Cassio and Gross, had carefully chosen the place. In the Senate, surrounded by accomplices and with the absence of loyal soldiers to Caesar, they could execute their plan with precision. The air was loaded with tension. Those who participated in the plot exchanged furtive looks, their hands trembled under the togas that hid the daggers. Everything was ready. Caesar arrived at the theater without escorts. His presence was imposing, his careful walk. He had disagreed the warnings, ignored the disturbing dreams of Calpurnia and the omens of the priests. The confidence in his own greatness blinded him. He was the man who had defeated his enemies, crossed prohibited limits and remodeled Rome. Who could dare to challenge him? Inside, the senators surrounded him quickly. First came the soft words, the requests disguised as respect. But then, Tilio Cimbro, one of the conspirators, pulled Caesar's toga, exposing his vulnerability. It was the signal. The doggers rose in unison, like a deadly choir, and pounced on the dictator. The first blow was clumsy, reaching his shoulder, but Caesar did not fall immediately. He defended himself with the strength of a soldier accustomed to the battlefield, pushing and dodging. However, there were too many. The room echoed with the screams, the echo of the steel colliding and the panting of the traitors. One after another, the knives sank into their body. And then, when he saw Brutus among the attackers, Caesar stopped resisting. With a last whisper that still resonates in collective memory, it fell to the ground, covered with blood. Pompey's theater, a witness of so many political decisions, was now a field of death. Pompey's statue seemed to observe the scene with irony, while Caesar's blood formed a puddle at his feet. The dictator's body was there, abandoned, while the conspirators fled, their togas dotted with red, their faces marked by the confusion between triumph and fear. Outside, the news spread like a fire on a dry night. Rome, that vibrant and chaotic city, was paralyzed. The people, who loved Caesar as a hero, could not understand the magnitude of what happened. The streets were filled with murmurs, cries and screams of anger. Many did not believe that their leader, the man who had brought glory to Rome, could be killed so cruelly. Soon, popular anger became an uncontrollable fury. The conspirators, who expected to be received as liberators, found themselves facing the fury of a crowd that demanded justice. Caesar's funeral, in the Forum, was the breakdown. Marco Antonio, his faithful ally, delivered a speech that further lit the mood. "This was Caesar," he shouted, pointing out the bloody body. "The man who loved you, who gave you land, who left your inheritance." When he showed the torn and bloody toga of Caesar, the people lost all containment. A roar of rage filled the air. The crowd threw himself against the houses of the conspirators, burning them. The streets of Rome became an absolute chaos, a reflection of the power void left by the death of Caesar. The murder that the senators had planned as an act to restore the Republic ended up being the beginning of a new chapter of violence and ambition. Rome, wounded and divided, now faced an uncertain future, while the flames of discontent burned in the hearts of their people. The echo of the March Ides would resonate for centuries, remembering that even the greatest men are not safe from betrayal. The Forum Square was crowded. Thousands of Roman citizens, from slaves to merchants and senators, congregated with tense faces, some bathed in tears, others full of a contained anger. Julius Caesar's body, covered by a white cloth, rested on an elevated platform. The visible wounds, still fresh, seemed to scream in silence the brutality of their murder. On them, the grey sky hid heavy, as if even the gods were mourning. Marco Antonio advanced to the podium with firm steps. His gaze was loaded with a mixture of pain and determination. I knew that moment was crucial. The Republic was fractured, and the crowd, confused and divided, needed a leader, someone who gave meaning to the tragedy. Antonio, Caesar's loyal friend, assumed that task with a speech that he would resonate over time. When he started talking, his tone was low, almost solemn. He did not try to immediately exalt Caesar as a god, but appealed to the man that everyone had known. Here lies Caesar, the man who walked among us, who fought for Rome and his people. His ambition, they say, was his crime. But what kind of ambition gives land to the poor? What kind of ambition cries with your people? Look now! Dead, betrayed by those who called friends. The crowd remained motionless, every word of Antonio seemed to penetrate his hearts. Then, with a calculated gesture, Marco Antonio lifted Caesar's bloody toga. He stirred it in the air, pointing out the tear that each stab had left. This is his toga, torn by the knives of betrayal. Here is the Casca brand. And here, Casio's. And here is the brute, his beloved gross. The cruelest blow of all. A murmur began to spread between the crowd, like a river that overflowed slowly. Antonio's words had lit something in the heart of the Romans. The pain and confusion began to transform into anger, a rage that fed with each sentence, with each pause calculated from their speech. Antonio, seeing the reaction, did not stop. He took Caesar's will, another as under his sleeve. "Citizens of Rome," he exclaimed, holding the scroll high. "Caesar loved you. And this document demonstrates it. In him, he leaves his wealth, his gardens, his lands. All this, for you, the people of Rome." The crowd exploded in shouts. Some cried, others raised their fists to heaven, crying out justice. Antonio withdrew from the podium, letting the chaos take over the square. He had sown the seeds of a rebellion, and now he was only waiting for germinating. Caesar's body, as if it were a divine spark, was consumed by fire in an impromptu pyre. The black smoke rose to heaven, carrying the memory of the man who had been more than a leader, more than a general. At that moment, Caesar ceased to be simply human. People began to talk about him as a god, a being destined for eternity. A temple was erected in his honor, and his name, Caesar, became synonymous with supreme power. The Forum, which once had witnessed debates and celebrations, was now an emotional battlefield. The pyre flames reflected the coals lit in the hearts of the Romans, who not only cried the loss of their leader, but also demanded revenge. The Republic, torn by the ambitions of the living, was now marked by the shadow of a man who, even in death, continued to shape the fate of Rome. Julius Caesar, the man whose life was defined by ambition, el to glory and betrayal, it has become an eternal, mold and toed figure over the centuries. Its history, loaded with heroism, tragedy and power, has fascinated artists, writers, and filmmakers, who have found in their life a perfect canvas to explore the human condition. From Roman theaters to contemporary film screens, Caesar has been represented as a symbol of greatness and warning about the dangers of power. In the theater, William Shakespeare immortalized Caesar in his work Julius Caesar, where the dictator is not the protagonist, but the axis around which he turns a drama loaded with political intrigue and morality. The famous phrase, "Et tu, brute!" It resonates in the stages of the world, capturing the heartbreaking moment of betrayal. In this work, Shakespeare not only portrays Caesar as an imposing leader, but also as a vulnerable man, caught between his destiny and the ambitions of those around him. The emotional intensity of the text leads the viewer to question the boundaries between loyalty and power, between justice and revenge. Beyond the theater, literature has also embraced the figure of Caesar. In the historical texts of Suetonio and Plutarch, he is presented as a complex character, full of contradictions. Suetonio, with his direct and often sensationalist style, describes a man of both virtue and vice. Plutarch, on the other hand, offers a more philosophical look, contrasting Caesar with Pompey to explore the nature of leadership and the impact of destiny on the life of great men. These works not only influenced Caesar's historical perception, but also served as a basis for innumerable subsequent interpretations. In visual art, Caesar's representations have evolved over time. Roman busts, with their attention to realism, show a man of marked features, a mixture of determination and wear. These sculptures, many of which were commissioned during their life, reflect the power and authority that it exerted on Rome. During the Renaissance, artists like Rubens and Tiziano reinterpreted Caesar in their paintings, providing him with almost divine greatness, wrapped in drama and symbolism. In these works, Caesar is seen not only as a leader, but as a mythical, almost tragic figure. The cinema, the narrative art of our era, has not been left behind in its fascination for Caesar. films such as Cleopatra, 1963, where Caesar was played by Rex Harrison, and Julius Caesar, 1953, starring Marlon Brando as Marco Antonio, present the dictator as a man of overwhelming charisma and a strategic mind without equal. These productions capture both their humanity and their myth, with great scenarios that reflect the splendor and decline of Rome. Even in modern series such as Rome, Caesar is represented as a multifaceted character, capable of inspiring loyalty and fear in the same extent. But perhaps the most shocking of these representations is how each generation projects its own values and concerns in the figure of Caesar. In times of revolution, it has been seen as a tyranny symbol, a reminder of the dangers of concentrating too much power on a single person. In moments of stability, he is presented as a visionary leader, capable of joining an empire under a common purpose. This duality ensures that Caesar will never be only a historical figure, but a mirror in which societies continue to be reflected. In classrooms, on stage, in museums, and on the screens, Caesar is still alive. His legacy is not limited to military victories or political reforms he made, but also resides in the power of his history to captivate, move, and teach. Each representation of Caesar, either as a hero, villain, or martyr, adds a new layer to his myth, ensuring that his name resonates for centuries. The figure of Julius Caesar not only left an indelible mark in his time, but became the catalyst of a transformation that would forever change the history of Rome. With his death, not only a man fell, the path for the transition from the Republic to the Empire was opened, a transition that was as inevitable as transcendental. Caesar's political legacy molded the basis on which Augusto and future emperors would build a more centralized, powerful and lasting Rome. Caesar, with his unparalleled ability to concentrate power, challenged the structures of the Republic. For centuries, Rome had been governed by a delicate balance between the Senate, the consuls, and the popular assemblies. However, the accumulation of internal crises and the ambitions of men like Caesar revealed the cracks of this system. Caesar not only used his military genius to gain battles, but also to win loyalties and redefine the concept of authority in Rome. With his ennombment as a perpetual dictator, broke with republican traditions, consolidating in his person a power that had previously been carefully dispersed. After his murder in the Ides of March, the Republic was found in an even greater chaos. Far from restoring ancient institutions, the power vacuum created by his death deepened the existing divisions. Marco Antonio, Lepido, and the young Octavio, grandson, nephew, and adopted heir of Caesar, formed the second triumvirate, but the tensions between them soon led to a new conflict. In this scenario, Octavio, later known as Augusto, emerged as the supreme leader, taking the lessons learned from the ascent and fall of Caesar to consolidate his own domain. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, was the architect of the imperial system, but the leadership model he adopted was clearly inspired by his uncle-grandfather. While Caesar had demonstrated how a leader could control Rome through charisma, reforms, and a direct relationship with the people and the army, Augusto refined this formula, establishing an appearance of republican restoration while actually accumulating an absolute power. Caesar, with his political and social reforms, had planted the seed of this centralization, and Augustus was responsible for flourishing it. Caesar's reforms, although controversial, also raided the way for the success of future emperors. His reorganization of the calendar, which introduced the Julian calendar, symbolizes the lasting influence of his administrative vision. In addition, its policies to expand Roman citizenship and regulate taxes laid the basis for a more inclusive and efficient empire. His pragmatic approach towards the integration of the provinces and his vision of a Rome that covered beyond Italy resonated in the expansionist politics of Augustus and the emperors who followed him. However, Caesar's political legacy was not limited to power structures. He also transformed the Roman collective imaginary. He was venerated as a semi-involvement, especially after his official deification by the Senate in the year 42 BC, 2 years after his death. The cult of Divus Iulius not only consolidated the prestige of his lineage, but also granted Augusto a divine legitimacy, allowing him to present himself as the Son of Man who had been elevated to heaven. Caesar also left an intangible but powerful legacy, the charismatic leader model that transcends the institutions. At a time when the Republic was fractured by personal interests and corruption, he embodied the possibility of a strong and determined government, capable of facing internal and external challenges. Although his life ended abruptly, his influence continued to shape the course of Rome for centuries. As Rome became an empire under the mandate of Augustus, Caesar's spectrum remained present. His name became synonymous with supreme power, to the point that the title Caesar was used as a denomination for Roman emperors and, subsequently, inspired terms such as Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia. Caesar's vision transcended the borders of his time, projecting as an eternal symbol of bold leadership and the complexities of power. Julius Caesar occupies a privileged place in universal history, not only as a central figure of ancient Rome, but also as a model of leadership, military strategy, and political ambition that has been compared to other great names of history. His influence transcends his time, and his actions, decisions, and legacy have been constantly studied, emulated, and discussed by generations. Throughout history, Caesar has been compared to visionary leaders such as Alejandro Magno, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Genghis Khan. Each of them, like Caesar, marked an era and redefined the limits of his known world. Alexander the Great, for example, shared with Caesar an excessive ambition and a military genius that allowed him to conquer vast territories in a surprisingly short time. Both had an innate ability to inspire their troops and turn them into instruments of their great visions, although Caesar, unlike Alejandro, had to navigate a much more complex political landscape within Rome. In the case of Napoleon Bonaparte, similarities are even more notable. Both leaders mounted from modest positions to become figures of absolute power, using their charisma and strategic skills to overcome their adversaries. Napoleon, like Caesar, was a reformer and an innovative in the field of politics and government. Both left a legacy of lasting reforms, such as the Napoleonic Code and the Julian calendar, which transcended their respective periods of government. Even their falls, although different in form, share a sense of inevitability, rocked by its own overflowing ambitions. As for Genghis Khan, although his leadership styles and cultural contexts were very different, both showed an extraordinary ability to understand the dynamics of power and adapt quickly to circumstances. While Genghis unified nomadic tribes to build the largest terrestrial empire in history, Caesar used political manipulation tactics and military genius to transform a republic into a crisis into a centralized state under his command. Caesar has also deeply influenced the modern military and political strategy. Its ability to combine audacity and calculation has been studied by strategists and leaders around the world. His famous decision to cross the Rubicon not only marked the beginning of a civil war, but also became an unvocable commitment symbol and boldness at critical moments. Phrases such as Valia Iacta Estate reflect their ability to transform decisive moments into personal myths that reinforce their leadership. In the military field, their campaigns in Gaul are a paradigmatic example of strategy and logistics. Caesar used tactics such as the construction of fortifications and the use of military engineering to overcome numerical and geographical disadvantages, a lesson that has been applied by armies in subsequent conflicts. His focus on the use of propaganda, as his writings comment on the War of Gaul, shows a deep understanding of how to shape public perception to strengthen his political and military position. Caesar's impact is not limited to the military and political field. His figure has also served as a mirror to reflect on tensions between absolute power and republican systems. In the context of universal history, their life and legacy are a reminder of the potential and dangers of power concentrated in a single individual. Caesar achieved great things, but his concentration of power also unleashed forces that finally led to the collapse of the Roman Republic. Its influence also extends to culture and political philosophy. From the writings of Machiavelli, who cited him as a model of virtue and pragmatism, to his representation in plays such as Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, Caesar remains a figure that causes admiration, controversy, and reflection. Ultimately, Julius Caesar remains a colossus in universal history, a figure that not only molded his time, but left lessons and legacies that continue to resonate in the present. It is both an inspiration and a warning, a representation of the heights to which an individual can reach and the dangers inherent to the excessive ambition. Julius Caesar is considered one of the greatest military geniuses in history, and his ability to adapt to complex situations and his ability to anticipate the movements of his enemies assured him a prominent place in military history. His campaigns, which covered from the cold plains of Gaul to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, were a deployment of tactics, strategy, and boldness. One of Caesar's main characteristics as a military leader was his exceptional ability to innovate on the battlefield. Not only was he reluctant in the brute force of his army, but also in his cunning mind to adapt the tactics to the circumstances he faced. His war method was not rigid, but fluid, which allowed him to face larger and better equipped armies than his. The campaign in Gaul is perhaps his masterpiece in terms of strategy. From the first confrontation against the Helvetios, Caesar showed his ability to act quickly and precision. Instead of waiting to be attacked, he advanced to his enemy and forced them to a direct confrontation. The famous Battle of Bibracte, where it managed to defeat a much larger army, is a clear example of how Caesar used intelligence to avoid wear and make quick decisions on the battlefield. His campaign against Germans also stands out for strategic innovation. He knew that his goal was not only to defeat enemies, but also send a clear message that Rome would not tolerate incursions outside their borders. Caesar crossed the Rhine, carrying his army beyond the known limits, something that surprised his adversaries and demonstrated his willingness to go beyond expected. One of Caesar's most outstanding tactics was his ability to use the land in his favor. In the Battle of Alesia, for example, Caesar surrounded the Gauls not only with his army, but also with a series of fortifications that allowed him to block any escape attempt or reinforcements. This innovative use of the terrain, along with its ability to maintain the morals of its high troops, gave it the decisive advantage in a battle that could have been catastrophic. Besides from tactics, Caesar was a teacher in logistics and discipline. He understood the importance of keeping his troops well supplied and organized, which allowed him to make long marches and maintain constant pressure on his enemies. This ability to support his army during prolonged campaigns was a crucial factor in his success, since he could wait and take advantage of any weakness that his opponent showed. But perhaps the most impressive of Caesar was his ability to combine war with politics. Not only conquered, but also knew how to win local populations. After each victory, he made sure to write and spread his exploits, not only as propaganda to reinforce his image, but also to gain the trust of the subjugated peoples. In this sense, his tactic was not only military, but also psychological, creating an aura of invincibility that demoralized his enemies even before facing him. His famous Veni, Vidi, Vici after the victory in Zala encapsulates his direct and decisive approach to the conflict. This rapid victory was not only a will of his ability to act without hesitation, but also of his ability to understand the psychology of his enemies. In this case, the defeat of Pharnaces II was so rapid and overwhelming that it left little space for resistance or reorganization. In the Mediterranean, during the civil war against Pompey, Caesar continued to show his tactical skill. In Pharsalia, one of his most emblematic battles, he faced Pompey in a battle that, despite numerical differences, resulted in a decisive victory for Caesar. The key to this victory was his ability to handle forces efficiently and keep his cohesive troops, while his enemy crumbled under the pressure of Caesar's rapid and decisive movements. The civil war was also a fertile field for its ability to anticipate enemy movements. While Pompey tried to reorganize his strength, Caesar attacked when they least expected him, in strategically advantageous places, making sure that his troops were always a step forward. His victory in Pharsalia was not only a demonstration of his military ability, but also of his ability to maintain the morale of his soldiers in times of uncertainty. Finally, the way Caesar managed logistics problems and popular support during the civil war is another testament of his military genius. While fighting Pompeo, Caesar also had to face the challenge of maintaining control of Rome and the provinces. Despite being at war, he managed to implement political reforms and gain the support of the commoners, which allowed him to strengthen his position within the city. Caesar, in his capacity as military leader, knew how to inspire his troops and make each campaign a joint effort between him and his soldiers. Not only was he a commander, but a symbol for his legions, and this led him to become more than a military leader, he became a myth. The legions followed him not only because of duty, but for the belief in his invincibility, something he cultivated with his charisma and his amazing strategic sense. In summary, Caesar was not only a brilliant military leader, but a true teacher in the art of war, capable of facing impossible circumstances and being victorious. Their campaigns are examples of how intelligence, innovation, and will can change the course of history. Rome was on the verge of collapse. The Republic, once a model of shared power and stability, was mired in corruption, inequality, and chaos. The patricia, rich and powerful class had absolute control, while most Romans, commoners, lived in poverty. Hunger, lack of land, and political violence toured the streets of the city. It was in the midst of this crisis when Julius Caesar, more than a simple military leader, became the man who tried to rebuild Rome, promoting social reforms that would change the fate of the city. Caesar knew that to maintain control, he not only needed the legions at his side, but also the support of the people. And to achieve this, he had to face the established interests of the Senate and the rich, who saw in him a threat to his domain. Throughout his mandate, Caesar introduced reforms that touched all aspects of Roman life, seeking to relieve the loads of the most disadvantaged while consolidating his power. One of the first reforms he implemented was in the field of land distribution. He knew that many commoner and war veterans were homeless or resources. In a Rome in which the rich bought lands indiscriminately, the poor were forced to live in deplorable conditions, without hope to improve. Caesar, at the same time as he fought external enemies, looked at his own Roman citizens, and understood that to earn their loyalty, they should guarantee that they had something that attached them to the earth. So he distributed land to his veterans, those who had followed him to the most distant corners of the empire. This reform helped stabilize soldiers and also control the growing social tensions within Rome. Along with agricultural reforms, Caesar launched an ambitious plan to control indebtedness. Many commoners were indebted to the neck, and the laws favored the rich, who took advantage of the despair of the poorest to impose conditions imposed through interests. Caesar, with his cunning, issued laws that limited interest rates, preventing debts from ruining the humblest families. With this action, he won the sympathy of the common Romans, who saw in Caesar a leader willing to fight for their rights. Caesar also understood that the reform of the judicial system was essential to give stability to the Republic. Corruption was rampant, and justice was subject to bribes and manipulations. The courts were tools at the service of the rich, who could get their own with a good payment or adequate contact. To change this, Caesar reformed the courts, eliminating the influence of senators and guaranteeing that justice was more accessible to all. Although their judicial reforms were seen as a threat to the aristocratic class, which benefited from corruption, the people saw in Caesar a justice defender. Another of the most transcendental changes was the reform of the calendar, which gave Rome a sense of order and precision. The Julian calendar, as we know today, was a masterpiece of organization and precision. But this reform, which seemed technical, had deep implications. The accuracy of the calendar allowed Rome to better plan its military campaigns, its crops, and its festivities, establishing an orderly rhythm in Roman life. However, not all reforms were well received. Many senators and aristocrats saw Caesar's reforms as a threat to their power and wealth. By giving land to veterans and reducing debts, Caesar was, in his eyes, undermining the system that had kept Rome standing for centuries. Although their reforms were popular among the lower classes, the senators saw in them a way of destabilizing the political system. The richness and power of the Roman oligarchy were threatened by a man who had not only conquered land, but now wanted to conquer the structure of the Republic itself. Even so, Caesar did not go back. Its reforms, although unpopular among the rich, cemented their support among the masses. In a city like Rome, where the people could easily be manipulated, Caesar understood that he had to seize the hearts and minds of commoners. In the Forum, his speeches were not just about military victories, he also talked about justice, equal opportunities for the most disadvantaged. His figure became that of a townman, a messiah who fought against the injustices of a system in decline. But Caesar was not only a social reformer. He was a visionary man who understood that to maintain power, it was not enough to win battles, but had to remodel Rome from his foundations. Not only wanted to be the leader of the Romans, he wanted to be the very incarnation of change. Its reforms touched the most sensitive aspects of everyday life, from bread to land, from justice to the calendar. His vision was clear: the Rome that he imagined should be a unified Rome, with less distinctions between classes, with less inequality, but above all, a Rome that was under its absolute leadership. Caesar not only wanted to save Rome from its internal crises, but also build a new Rome. He knew he couldn't do it alone, and that's why he leaned on the masses. However, at the same time that he carried out his reforms, he cultivated a personality cult that allowed him to erect himself as the undisputed leader of the city. Rome was about to live a transformation that was no longer going back. Rome never imagined what would happen when Caesar set foot in Egypt. The warm breeze of the Nile collided with the fury of Roman ambition, and the fate of two worlds began to intertwine. In the old palace of Alexandria, among the stones loaded with history, one of the most legendary alliances of all time was born, the relationship between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. In 48 BC, Caesar arrived in Egypt not only as a conqueror, but also as a man drifting, seeking support to consolidate his power in Rome. But, instead of finding simple taxes and resources, what he found was a young reina that ruled a chaotic country full of internal tensions. Cleopatra, intelligent, persuasive and ambitious, soon saw in Caesar an opportunity to return his ancient greatness to Egypt. Immediately, he saw the potential of that relationship, not only because of what Caesar could do for Egypt, but for what she could offer the Roman general. The story of his encounter is as fascinating as mysterious. It is said that Cleopatra, to avoid the military block of his brother Ptolemy XIII, appeared before Caesar in a bold as brilliant way, rolled on a carpet. Literally, he was brought before him. With the cunning of a woman ready for everything, he knew how to earn her attention. It was not only its beauty that impressed, but its intelligence and its deep understanding of the intricate political realities. For Caesar, she was not just an exotic queen, but a strategist willing to help her achieve her goals. But beyond politics, mutual interests, there was something else in that relationship. A personal connection that grew rapidly between the two. Cleopatra, although surrounded by luxury and power, lived with the constant threat of being stripped of her throne by palatial intrigues and internal struggles. He found a protector in Caesar, but also a fascinating man, someone who not only had the power to change the fate of Egypt, but somehow touched his heart. The romance between them was not just a political issue, it was a love in the middle of a storm, a relationship built on the complicity of two extraordinary minds. Caesar, meanwhile, found a woman who was not afraid to challenge conventions in Cleopatra. While Rome was still convulsed by internal struggle and civil war, Egypt offered a respite full of exotism and promises. In it, he saw an ally more solid than any Roman senator or general. The Queen of Egypt knew how to play with power, how to use her sex appeal and intelligence to get what she needed. The relationship with Caesar not only offered him an ally in Rome, but also the opportunity to consolidate his kingdom and restore his position against the powerful of Egypt. His relationship transcended the personal, becoming a vital political alliance. Cleopatra, who had been defeated by his brother Ptolemy XIII, found in Caesar not only a lover, but a savior. With Caesar's help, he recovered the throne, reaffirming his sovereignty over Egypt. In return, Caesar not only obtained riches and crucial resources for his struggle in Rome, but ensured the faithfulness of Egypt, a key kingdom for its imperial ambition. It was a game of power, mutual interests, but also a dance of passions and temptations. The impact of his relationship was deep. Egypt, under the influence of Cleopatra and Caesar, became a prosperous ally for Rome, and the queen made sure the story remembered her name. In that brief period, Cleopatra not only consolidated his power, but also modernized Egypt, expanding the borders of his influence and ensuring that the kingdom remained outside the external threats. Although his relationship with Caesar was not eternal, the impact was huge. The power of Rome and the knowledge of Egypt merged momentarily, leaving an indelible mark on the history of the ancient world. Caesar, on the other hand, never stopped thinking about the influence of Cleopatra. When he left for Rome, he carried a son of his, Caesarion, whose future became a symbol of both the link between them and the great dreams of conquest and expansion of Caesar. Although his relationship with Cleopatra did not translate into a lasting alliance, the legacy of his union lasted in the figures that left behind. Cleopatra continued to fight to maintain her power, but the shadow of Rome and her interests always harassed her. While Caesar advanced in her conquests, her relationship with the Egyptian queen went down in history as a symbol of convergence between two powerful worlds, a reflection of what could have been a great shared empire, although that idea never became realized. The impact of Caesar and Cleopatra in the history of Egypt was indisputable. The presence of Rome in Egypt was more palpable, and although Cleopatra never stopped fighting for its independence, the traces of the alliance with Caesar marked the trajectory of Egypt for years. The relationship between the two left a complex legacy, full of intrigue, love, power, and tragedy, a story as fascinating as the Nile himself who saw them join. In the end, the two separated, but they were never forgotten. In Rome, the love between Caesar and Cleopatra became a legend, a romance that crossed the borders of time, symbolizing the best and worst of a world ruled by ambition, love and power. Caesar was not just a military leader or a cunning politician, he was a man full of contradictions, a figure that reflected greatness as weakness. While his name remained synonymous with power and ambition, behind that facade of commander and dictator, there was a complex human being, with his own virtues, defects, and internal struggles. The first virtue that Julius Caesar is obvious is his extraordinary intelligence. Not only was it a brilliant military strategist, capable of reading the movements of their enemies as if they were letters on a table, but also understood human psychology perfectly. He knew how to earn the support of the people, how to move the political pieces in their favor, and how to manipulate appearances. For him, everything was a matter of calculation, what to say, what to do and when. This ability to read the right time, either on the battlefield or in the intricate struggles of the Roman Senate, gave it an advantage over others. But that cunning, which made it succeed, was also a double-edged sword. Caesar was never oblivious to the temptations of power, and his insatiable desire for personal control and glory led him to make decisions that showed his defects. In his search to consolidate his power, he distanced himself from the republican traditions that defined Roman politics. Somehow, his achievements were also their arrogance evidence. In his mind, everything he did was justified by his superiority. If it weren't for him, Rome would be lost. However, that same selfish vision led him to lose sight of the needs and wishes of the people, which always longed for a balance between the ruling elites and those who lived in the shadows of the city. As for his relationship with others, Caesar was both a charismatic leader and a man who did not hesitate to use others as pawns in his own game. Although he was able to create solid and deep alliances, those relationships were never really free of interest. His friendship with Crassus and Pompey, which would end up being one of the greatest disagreements of his life, was more a matter of convenience than true camaraderie. The betrayal was not alien to him, and although he surrounded himself with loyal people, those loyalties were forged under the weight of the reward and the promise of power, not by pure admiration. Thus, throughout his career, Caesar showed an inherent distrust of others, always with an eye in the future, ready to cut alliances when they were no longer useful. On the other hand, his humanity also shone in the least expected moments. Despite his power, Caesar was still a man subject to his emotions, to his passions. He was a man in love, a man who felt love at his expression, either for Cleopatra or his daughter Julia, whose death was a devastating blow to him. The image of a cold and calculator Caesar falls apart when you think about her pain before the departure of those who loved the most. In his most vulnerable moments, Caesar showed that, behind the red toga, there was a man who, like anyone, experienced sadness, fear and frustration. His love life was also another facet in which his contradictions manifested. While his relationships, such as his relationship with Cleopatra or his wives, were strategic, there was some genuine in his affection. Despite his power, he was a man who could not escape the emotional dynamics of everyday life. His romances, both public and secret, showed their struggle between the desire for control and the need for affection. In terms of his character, Caesar was also remarkably brave. In his campaigns, he did not settle for giving orders from the rear. He was in charge of his troops, sharing his victories and defeats, always willing to show that he was not only a distant leader, but also a warrior who lived for the same as his soldiers. This courage made him even more dear among his men, who saw a commander in him, but to a weapon's brother. However, this same courage on the battlefield, where his life was constantly in danger, became a lack of prudence in his political life. His ambition led him to take risks that cost him life. The same courage that made him invincible on the battlefield led him to pride in his decision-making. One of the most complex aspects of his personality was his relationship with death. Throughout his career, Caesar faced the danger closely, but he never seemed to fear death. There was something almost inevitable in his attitude towards life. He believed he was destined for something bigger than his own existence. However, in the last moments of his life, when auguries and warnings began to arrive, he was aware of the fatality he stalked. Perhaps he never thought that his end would come to those who trusted the most, but still, he was not afraid to face his destiny. Caesar's story is, in many ways, that of a man who fought against his own fears, but at the same time never stopped pursuing their dreams, even when those dreams demanded colossal sacrifices. Julius Caesar was a figure marked by contradictions. The brilliant leader and the common man. The strategist who transformed Rome and the man who lost himself in his own desires of power. For every virtue he showed, there was also a defect that counteracted him. And, ultimately, those same contradictions were the ones that made it so human. A man who the Roman Empire could never forget, but, at the same time, was forgotten by those who once considered him a friend. Julius Caesar, a man whose power over Rome was so vast, also had a deep connection with the Roman religion, a fundamental aspect of everyday life in ancient Rome. His rise to power was not only marked by his political cunning and military skills, but also by his link with religious beliefs and rituals that shaped Roman society. Being a maximum pontiff, the maximum religious leader of Rome, gave him an authority that went beyond politics, making him a central figure not only into the life of the Romans, but also in his spiritual destiny. Becoming a maximum pontiff was a crucial step in Caesar's career, since religion in Rome was not something separate from politics. The power of a leader was not only measured by his victories in battle or his territorial conquests, but also because of his divine influence. As a maximum pontiff, Caesar not only supervised religious rituals, but was also the guardian of public morals, responsible for maintaining the connection between the gods and the Roman people. This position gave absolute control over the religious life of Rome, a symbolic power that allowed him to maintain a balance between what the Romans wanted in their hearts and what they needed to justify their actions before the gods. This religious role not only reinforced his political power, but also granted a special legitimacy. As a pontiff, Caesar not only acted as the intermediary between the gods and the Romans, but his image merged with the divinity itself. In fact, his personality cult was strongly linked to his religious image. His relationship with the gods was not something that would be limited to rituals or ceremonies. Caesar looked himself as a chosen one, a man touched by the gods to bring Rome to a new era. As his power grew, he also did his self-image as a divine figure, a son of the gods. The idea that Caesar was a man destined for divine greatness was consolidated in the creation of imperial cult, a phenomenon that would mark Rome for centuries. After his death, his divinization was quickly approved by the Senate, and Caesar was elevated to the status of god. A temple was founded in his honor and his figure began to give cults, a practice that would continue with his heir, Augustus, who adopted the figure of Caesar as a patron god of the Roman Empire. Caesar not only left a legacy as a political and military leader, but as the founder of a new era in the Roman religion, where political power and divine worship were intertwined. This divine connection was key to understanding Caesar's perception in Rome. He was not just a man who sought to govern, he was a chosen one, a man with a divine mission. His relationship with the gods and his position as a maximum pontiff not only gave him control over the spiritual life of Rome, but also consolidated his image as the protector of the city, the man whose destiny was to guide Rome towards its maximum splendor. However, this power was not exempt from controversies. The senators, mostly traditional, began to see with increasing distrust the sum of power that Caesar concentrated. His growing identification with the gods was seen as a threat to the Republic, whose stability had always depended on the balance between the various factions and authorities. While Caesar advanced towards a proclamation of his divinity, fears were unleashed on the end of Roman freedom. The conspirators, who would finally murder him in the Ides of March, saw in their proclamation as an eternal and almost divine leader a sign of their growing tyranny. The idea that Caesar could be considered a god in life touched the very core of republican freedoms and the traditions of Rome, where power was destined to be ephemeral and not eternal. At the popular level, however, Caesar was not only admired as a powerful leader, but also as a protector sent by the gods. In his last years, people began to see not only man in him, but an almost mythical figure. During his life, Caesar became an icon, a symbol of Roman glory and the benevolence of the gods, a man capable of bringing to Rome to new heights, both in power and in prestigio. In this context, the figure of Caesar began to have a sacred dimension, far beyond politics. Caesar's transformation into an immortal god after his murder culminated the divinization process that he had begun to gestate. His name continued to resonate in Rome long after his death. The cult of Caesar was not only consolidated in temples, but was also adopted by future generations as a way of remembering the rise of Rome to absolute power. Caesar's divinity was not only a recognition of his role in the history of Rome, but also a symbol of the definitive change towards the empire, where the emperors not only ruled to Rome, but were seen as divine figures, touched by hand of the gods. In practice, Caesar as a maximum pontiff was not only a man of political power, but also the custodian of Roman spirituality. His link with the gods allowed his influence to extend far beyond the walls of Rome. Since his death, Caesar's image was so powerful that over the centuries, his divine heritage would continue to be celebrated, transforming him not only into a political leader, but into a living legend whose figure would continue to be part of the Roman collective memory. Caesar, a man who ascended from the shadows of Roman politics until he became the most powerful leader of his time, has been the subject of debate for centuries. Was it a visionary hero who brought Rome to new heights, or a tyrant who destroyed republican freedom for his own benefit? The answer, as with many great characters in history, is not simple. His figure has been interpreted in various ways, depending on the lens with which his life and actions are observed. The Romans themselves were divided. Some saw it as a savior, others like the destroyer of an era that had defined the Roman Republic. Caesar began his career as an ambitious, but also charismatic man, capable of connecting with the masses, a leader who seemed to be destined to do great things. Through his military victories, such as the conquests of the Gaul and their victories in the Civil War, he consolidated his image as the hero who rescued Rome from internal crises. People saw him as someone who, through his reforms and achievements, would return to Rome to the greatness that the Republic seemed to have lost. The popular support Caesar enjoyed was undeniable, and his ability to inspire his soldiers and Roman citizenship did not have the same. His focus on social reforms, laws for poor and exiles, granted respect for a large part of Roman society. How could someone with so many virtues and achievements be considered a tyrant? However, the same characteristics that a popular leader did were also those who sowed fear in the hearts of their detractors. The accumulation of power in the hands of a single man was seen as a threat by those who valued the republican system of Rome. Senators, elites, and traditional Romans began to see him as a man who not only sought greatness for Rome, but for himself. Caesar's proclamation as a perpetual dictator was the breakdown point. For many, that action not only meant the end of the Republic, but also the end of freedom that the Romans valued so much. Instead of a republican leader who worked for the people, many saw Caesar as the leader of a monarchy, a man who wanted to govern Rome with the absolute power of a king. The cult of personality that grew around him, with his divinized image and his growing influence on the Senate, became the main reason for his opposition. The fact that it was self-proclaiming almost divine generated a deep distrust. Was this Caesar himself who had promised to fight for justice and equality? Or had it fallen into the trap of becoming the monster he had always promised to avoid? The conspirators who finally murdered him in the Ides of March, including figures such as Grose and Cassio, considered that the only way to save the Republic was to eliminate Caesar. For them, the man who had been acclaimed as a town leader had crossed the line between being a hero and becoming a dictator. Was it the only way to protect Rome? The answer, in his minds, was clear. Caesar's murder was a desperate action to prevent the Roman Republic from falling apart under its domain. But who was right? Was Caesar simply a man who tried to achieve the best for Rome, or had sacrificed the freedom of his citizens for his own excessive ambition? This debate about Caesar is not only limited to the figures of his time, but is still alive today. Historians and scholars are divided into their opinions. Some see it as a British English advance to his time, a visionary who understood that the Roman Republic was obsolete, while others consider him a tyrant whose arrogance led to his own destruction. Caesar's story raises the eternal question about the boundary between legitimate power and abuse of power. The story is not always kind to those who cross that line, but the figure of Caesar, as a hero and tyrant, has transcended time. And the question persists, can we forgive a man who, although he was looking for the well-being of his city, did it at the expense of the freedom of all others? Was Caesar simply a man who understood what Rome needed at the time, or was it a man who sacrificed everything for power? In every corner of history, its figure remains a shadow that invites you to question, discuss, and remember that, ultimately, the fate of great men is always a mixture of glory and condemnation. Caesar's echo resonates even today, long after his death. The man who transformed Rome and who rose as the central figure of his time, left a mark so deep that, to this day, his influence is still present in power structures, leadership, and modern politics. Its history, marked by conquests, intrigue, sacrifices, and an unlimited ambition, has been constantly interpreted and reinterpreted by thinkers and leaders of all corners of the world. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon and rebelled against the Senate, challenging the established order, he not only initiated a civil war that would change the face of Rome, but also resulted in a new era in the exercise of power. The centralization of power in a single individual was a lesson that was not lost in future generations. Modern rulers, often, are trapped between internal struggles and aspirations for absolute control. Throughout history, many have observed the figure of Caesar as a model to follow to consolidate power, face internal resistance, and affirm their control over institutions. The totalitarian leaders of the 19th and 20th centuries could not avoid looking towards their figure, fascinated by their ability to subjugate opponents and forge a path that seemed unwavering. The concept of perpetual dictator that Caesar embraced is a legacy that persists in many parts of the world. Although the figure of a leader who governs absolutely is rejected in democratic systems, the tensions between the centralization of power and the limits imposed by institutions are still a matter of hot debate. How can democratic forces be balanced with the need for strong leadership? To what extent should a leader be able to make unilateral decisions in times of crisis, without this becoming a threat to civil liberties? Caesar, with his rise to power and his eventual proclamation as a dictator, provides an inevitable reference in those debates. In the modern political sphere, the figure of Caesar has been used as a warning, but also as an inspiration. Authoritarian regimes and leaders with dictatorial trends have found in it an example of how to transform a republic into an empire under the control of a single person. Caesar's story becomes a kind of manual of how to acquire absolute power, handle the opposition, and consolidate control, and all this while still being acclaimed by the people. His charisma, his ability to handle the emotions of the crowd, and his apparent dedication to the well-being of the Roman people have served as a guide for those who have wanted to manipulate public opinion and increase their influence. On the other hand, the story of his murder cannot be ignored in this analysis. Caesar's murderers, motivated by the belief that his death would return freedom to the Roman people, have also left an important teaching. The fear of tyranny and the need to protect the institutions of freedom has led many modern societies to develop break and counterweight systems to avoid the concentration of power in one person. Caesar, with his brutal death at the hands of those who feared what he represented, shows the vulnerability of a centralized regime that does not take into account the warnings and wishes of those who are under his command. His figure has also been referenced in the context of modern political propaganda. The way Caesar built himself as an unstoppable leader, such as El Salvador de Rome, is seen today in the way in which politicians and leaders build their image before the public. The speeches, the use of symbols and promises of greatness and transformation are not only Caesar tactics, but also tools of current politicians who seek to consolidate their power through the manipulation of public perception. What most restless is how, even in contemporary democracies, power systems can be as fragile as the Roman Republic was. The control mechanisms and the separation of powers, which seem so solid and fundamental, can weaken when charismatic figures manage to manipulate popular opinion in their favor. Caesar taught the world that the charisma and emotional manipulation of the masses can be as effective as any army in the struggle for power. His ability to attract crowds, to promise immediate improvements while ensuring their loyalty, is a lesson that has not been forgotten. Caesar's file and its enduring influence are also observed in how modern governments handle crises. Caesar, in its reforms, in its civil war, and in its management of the different provinces, showed that in times of agitation, a strong leader may be the key to restoring the order, although the price of this order may be individual freedom. This perspective on the need for strong leadership in times of crisis has resurfaced repeatedly throughout history, especially in times of political instability. Today, when world leaders face internal and external challenges, they cannot avoid thinking about the history of Caesar, their ascent, their struggle for power, and the way in which their ambition changed forever the history of Rome. But, at the same time, they also reflect on their fall. Caesar's story is full of lessons about the abuse of power, tensions between freedom and authority, and how a charismatic figure can both redeem and destroy a civilization. Caesar's long shadow continues to project on modern politics. His life and legacy not only influence today's politicians and leaders, but also invites us to reflect on the nature of power, leadership, and risks of power concentration in the hands of a single individual. Julio Caesar's life lessons remain a powerful source of reflection for current generations. Through his meteoric ascent and tragic fall, Caesar left a legacy of teachings that go beyond the borders of time and space. Although his life was marked by ambition and conflict, he was also testimony to the determination, strategy, and ability to navigate in a political world full of challenges. Modern generations can learn a lot when observing their figure, both what should be emulated and what should be avoided. One of the most obvious lessons that Caesar left is the importance of bold and decisive leadership. In a world where decisions are often delayed by indecision or fear of consequence, Caesar was a man who acted without hesitation. His decision to cross the Rubicon was the beginning of a radical change not only for him, but for Rome. In modern politics, where leaders often feel trapped between external commitments and pressures, Caesar's example recalls that, in critical moments, decisive actions can be the key to making a difference. However, this lesson must also be accompanied by the reflection on the limits, because, in its eagerness for total victory, Caesar ended up losing his humanity and the connection with those who initially supported him. Caesar's ambition, although excessive and, in many ways, destructive, also shows the importance of vision and perseverance. He was not content to be a senator or a recognized general. His goal was to completely transform the structure of Roman power and mark his own destiny. For many, this type of excessive ambition can be seen with skepticism, but it is indisputable that it was his ability to visualize a different future that led him to become one of the most important figures in history. Today, modern leaders and entrepreneurs can learn from Caesar the importance of having a clear vision and fighting for it, even when facing almost insurmountable obstacles. But it must also be an ambition that does not deviate towards selfishness or disdain for others. In addition, Caesar was a propaganda teacher. His ability to control the narrative of his own life, presenting himself as the savior of Rome, as a people of people and an unstoppable leader, is something that remains relevant in contemporary politics. The way it was surrounded by symbols and used its image to reinforce their power shows how leaders can manipulate public perceptions in their favor. In today's world, where image and communication play a fundamental role in politics, public figures learn that controlling narrative can be a powerful tool to achieve and maintain power. However, this also brings with it the risk of being perceived as someone who manipulates the truth for their own benefit, something that Caesar could not avoid. Throughout his life, Caesar also showed the importance of strategic alliances. His ability to form relationships with key figures such as Pompey and Crassus allowed him to achieve the power he wanted. But its end also teaches us about the difficulties inherent in alliances, especially when personal interests and ambitions collide. Today, in a world where political relations and strategic alliances are crucial, Caesar's lessons show that alliances can be powerful, but should always be based on mutual confidence and not only on momentary interests. In addition, its fall reminds us that alliances can be broken at any time, and that political survival requires constant attention to changing dynamics. In terms of social and economic reforms, Caesar also left an important legacy. It was a reformer who understood the need to change the existing structures to adapt to the new realities. Its reforms, especially those that aim to distribute land among veterans and make the Roman provinces more effective, show the importance of listening to the masses and responding to popular needs. Modern politics can learn a lot from this approach to social and economic well-being, remembering that economic reforms and inclusive policies are essential for the longer-term well-being of a nation. Despite its great achievements, Caesar is also an example of how absolute power can corrupt. His proclamation as a perpetual dictator, although a reflection of his enormous influence, shows that it is never safe to centralize power in a single figure. The fear of his contemporaries, who feared that his power would become an absolute and that he threatens the republic itself, is a warning for modern leaders about the dangers of concentrating too much power on a single person. Contemporary democracies must learn to maintain a balance between the executive power and other branches of the government, always vigilant against the risk of tyranny. Caesar's death also has important lessons. It was a reminder that not even the most powerful leaders are invincible. His murder was the result of a conjunction of those who considered him a threat to the republic. This event underlines a crucial lesson: power can be ephemeral and those who feel invulnerable can be demolished at any time. For current generations, this is a warning about the limits of power, the importance of listening to those under your command, and the need to stay humble even when it reaches the top. In the end, Caesar's life is a complex mixture of virtues and defects, of exceptional achievements and fatal failures. Current generations can learn a lot from their history, but they must do it with a deep and balanced reflection. Power, ambition, alliances, and the ability to communicate with the crowd are powerful lessons, but so are the reminders that every leader must be aware of the limits of power and the risks of autocracy. The ascent and fall of the colossi in human history is an eternal account of ambition, power, and the struggle for control. Over the centuries, titanic figures have risen from the darkness of insignificance to the highest peaks of power, only to be dragged back in the shadow by the same forces that once raised them. It is a repetitive cycle that seems to govern the great stories of humanity: men and women who rise for their determination, their skill and vision, but whose fall is precipitated when they are consumed by the same forces that promoted them towards success. In the center of this dynamic is the human ambition, that primary spark that pushes individuals to challenge destiny, to overcome the limits imposed by nature or society, and to leave their mark in history. But what happens when this ambition becomes an obsession? What happens when the desire for power becomes the only engine of an existence, without any brake that stops its advance? The story is full of examples of people who, when reaching the stars, lost contact with the earth. The most emblematic figures in history, those colossi that reached unquestionable power positions, were also those that suffered the most loud fall. From the great emperors to the generals who led empires, they all shared a characteristic: the insatiable desire to conquer, expand, and perpetuate their domain. But it is precisely that ambition that may be your downfall. Power, once reached, is not a garment that can be stored in a case. It is a double-edged sword, a force that, if it is not handled with skill, it can become against it that wields it. Each fall of a colossus brings with it a deep reflection on the contradictions inherent in power. Those who arrived at the top made him sacrificing, in many cases, his humanity, his principles, his ethics, all in the name of greatness. However, greatness is not always enough to guarantee its permanence. The betrayals, internal struggles, overflowing passions, and broken relationships are the ghosts that stalk those who believe they have reached a state of absolute power. It is as if the story itself had a cruel way to balance things. When the ego reaches its peak, the universe finds the way to balance it, with the inevitable fall of those colossi. The lessons of the fall are painfully clear. The insatiable thirst for power, when it is not moderate by the humility or awareness of the limits, has the power to destroy everything. Those who think that power is a fixed and eternal domain soon discover that it is as volatile as air. Those who were once loved by the crowds, who believed to be invincible, are dragged to the same darkness that once dominated. It is in this fall where history becomes a warning. Excessive ambition not only consumes the individual, but can drag with it to nations, peoples, and even entire civilizations. Power is never just an individual achievement. It is a reflection of societies that allow their ascent, a testimony of the connection between the rulers and the governed. When that relationship breaks, when the people stop seeing their leaders as legitimate, the colossus begins to stagger. The fall of the greatest leaders is often not an external blow, but an internal decomposition, betrayal within their own circles, the lack of popular support, the rejection of those who once offered promises. Therefore, the reflection that arises from the rise and fall of the colossi is deep. Human ambition can lead us to incredible places, to vertiginous heights, but it can also consume if we do not know how to handle it with wisdom and humility. Power, when obtained, is not a final victory, but a constant and conscious work to prevent it from becoming the destructive force that destroys us. It is humility against power that can finally guarantee that it does not fall into the trap of self-destruction. History reminds us that true greatness is not measured by the size of the built empires or by the duration of reigns, but by the ability to recognize our own limits, to understand that power must be a means for common well-being and not an end in itself. True greatness lies in knowing when to release, when to stop controlling the uncontrollable, and when to walk towards the sunset without wanting to reach the stars at the cost of everything else. The fall of the Colossi is, ultimately, a testimony of human fragility, how pride and desire for immortality can be the forces that destroy us, even when we believe we are at top. Power and ambition, when they are not managed with balance, they can generate a glory bubble that explodes when we least expect it. The history of the Colossi is the story of each of us, a reminder that, although we can reach the stars, we must remember that we are human. The figure of Julius Caesar transcends the story of Rome, becoming an eternal symbol. His name is synonymous with power, of excessive ambition, but also of transformation. In collective memory, Caesar has been elevated to the category of myth. It is not only the general who conquered the Gaul or the man who crossed the Rubicon. It is much more than that, it is the very representation of the ascent and fall of the great men, of those who try to challenge the laws of nature, fate, and time. The weight of his legacy is inscribed in every corner of history, and his shadow is projected on politics and culture, not only of Rome, but of the entire world. When we think of him, we not only evoke the dictator, the charismatic and military leader, but to a man who, through his decisions, mold the story itself. The reforms that promoted in the Roman Republic are still debated, their battles are still studied in military academies around the world, and their life has been immortalized in a constant narrative of admiration and criticism. But Caesar is, above all, a character whose death cemented his immortality. The brutal way in which he was killed, the fact that his own friends and allies betrayed him, makes him a tragic figure. The Roman people cried their death, but at their funeral, they raised him to the category of God. In this way, Caesar became divinity. Your connection with Venus genetics, Mother D, and the Roman lineage granted him a privileged place among the gods. In historical memory, Caesar is no longer only a human being, but an almost supernatural figure that is still alive in mythology. His place in Roman mythology is that of a being that, despite his defects and contradictions, reached a legendary status. With each act, Caesar became an archetypal figure, the tragic hero, the fallen king, the man who tried to redraw the future of Rome and, in doing so, forged his destiny irreversibly. His rise, his fall, and the way in which his death triggered the transformation of the Republic in the Empire, has made him a legend that resonates in every corner of history. In the collective imaginary, Caesar has been so central that his name is almost synonymous with absolute leadership. Not only is he remembered for what he achieved, but for what he represented, the culmination of the Roman dream and, at the same time, the warning of what happens when that dream overflows, when the desire for power becomes a destructive force that drags everything in its path. Even centuries after his death, Caesar is still fascinated. His life has been narrated, rewritten, adapted to theatre, cinema, literature. Each interpretation of Caesar adds one more layer to his myth. It has been embodied by actors, discussed by historians, and examined by philosophers. The questions about their ambition, their character, and destiny will never stop resonating. And although his figure is complex, the truth is that Caesar achieved what many only dream of: leave an indelible mark on history. His immortality does not lie only in what he did while he lived, but in how his life and death have been absorbed by generations, transforming into a universal symbol. The man who crossed the Rubicon and challenged the Senate has transcended the barriers of time, being unforgettable, eternal. Caesar's story is no longer just a Roman narrative, it is a fundamental part of the history of mankind. Thus, Julius Caesar lives in the stories of those who, like him, seek to leave their mark in the world, fighting the forces of destiny, challenging the established order. And although his life was marked by contradiction, drama, and tragedy, his legacy endures as a reminder of what it means to be a colossus in history, and the finitude that accompanies those who reach such immense greatness. In historical memory, Caesar will never die, because